Chapter 631 to 210, Exposure. Inside the Great Hall, two goddesses of beauty faced each other, with the divine king's power pouring out in all directions. However, for the moment, even as he tried to stop them with his imposing aura, Zeus still didn't know how to proceed. The recent events had changed too abruptly. The handover of the golden apple and Aphrodite's rash action all happened in an instant, and he needed some time to understand the before and after of these events. It was supposed to be a planned conspiracy. So how did the golden apple suddenly end up in Keto's hands? The key lay in that mortal's choice. Everything had been going smoothly just moments ago, but the situation had drastically changed, all because of the other party's sudden decision. Zeus's gaze swept over the area where Andrea had been, and, as expected, she had already retreated to a corner. So, had he fallen into someone else's trap? Had Athena seen through his thoughts, or was someone else pulling the strings? If someone else had influence here, then how did they know what he intended to do? After all, besides him, only Discordia and the goddess of life knew about this. Was there a betrayal among them? Most importantly, what purpose did the person who planned all of this have? What was their goal? Countless doubts arose in his mind, and at that moment, Zeus even began to doubt Hera. In fact, this was precisely what Laine had wanted from his scheme. It must be noted that although Andrea was a priestess of Athena, she still harbored the power of the heavenly empress within her. Her sacred power firmly locked away. Where had she initially been abducted? Of course, it was on the sea. This caused the situation to spiral into chaos immediately. Zeus couldn't determine who was orchestrating all of this since Hera's motivation existed. She and Aphrodite had a long-standing feud, and now it seemed plausible that after discovering Zeus's scheme, the heavenly empress had secretly reached out to the ancient sea god faction. However, at this moment, these speculations were overturned because Laine's original misdirection needed Keto to retrieve the golden apple and then return straight to hell. This shifted the entire situation to involve a third party meddling in the scheming, leaving even Hera in the dark, and the Lord of the Nine Hells seeming to be the greatest beneficiary. At that point, internally, Zeus would have to deal with the heavenly empress who undermined his planning, even if she offered explanations, and it was doubtful whether the divine king would believe her. Externally, he had to be wary of the suddenly evident grand presence of the Hell faction, as the demons, though they had plotted for souls in the mortal realm before, were always considered by Olympus to be akin to evil gods, which hadn't seemed like much of an issue. Simultaneously, internal and external threats exploded, almost certainly causing immense trouble for Zeus. And while Keto had ignited some internal conflicts within the divine court, this was still just limited to suspicions and wouldn't evolve into war, serving only to distract Zeus. Unsurprisingly, as long as Andrea managed to escape successfully, making the key witness disappear without a trace, Laine's objective would be achieved. Whatever Zeus had originally wanted to do would definitely be greatly delayed. But now, everything had moved in a different direction. Keto hadn't left, she was openly confronting Aphrodite. Clearly, at the instigation of the Lord of the Nine Hells, she had never intended to keep the conflict within a manageable degree but planned to dive directly into the fray and ignite a full-blown escalation. Asmodeus wanted the gods to clash, war to erupt in the mortal realm, faith to be weakened, and sovereignty to be shaken. He had no interest in maintaining the stability of the current world. He only wanted to muddy the waters, conceal his own power for a while, and then create an opportunity to join in this grand play of the mortal realm. Unfortunately, an unexpected event occurred again. Because even Asmodeus, observing the mortal realm through Keto's eyes, hadn't anticipated that among the gods present, someone could recognize hints of his origin from just a look. And the fact that they were able to do this had its roots in him. "It's you, that look. No, indeed, it wasn't a coincidence that you appeared there back then. Keto, what is your relation to purgatory?" With a sudden shout, Hestia uttered a term that was very unfamiliar to most deities, while Zeus was startled. Almost immediately, he remembered something his elder sister had mentioned. Purgatory. A mysterious entity that Hestia had encountered during the destruction of the Bronze Age. On the ruins of human civilization, the souls of the Bronze Age had vanished, and at that time, even though she was a goddess of great divine power, Hestia was no match for the opponent. And it seemed that Keto was also present at that time? Purgatory, or rather, hell. His gaze gradually became cold. Since that encounter, the mysterious person's existence had always been a thorn in Zeus's side, which also reignited his sense of crisis. hence his decisive incursion into Asgard to gain further opportunities. However, in his conjecture, the entity Hestia had encountered back then was probably a peak ancient god of immense divine power, only its origins were unclear. Thus, as his strength grew over time and there was no further news of this entity, Zeus eventually put this matter aside. But now, could there be more to come? Keto, setting aside your affair with Aphrodite for a moment, shouldn't you explain what exactly you did during the extermination of bronze humanity? In the temple, the situation shifted once again. Flames surrounded the goddess of hearthfire, and Zeus also turned his gaze towards Keto. He had previously overlooked it, but now that he had discovered it, he was eager to know who that being who had encountered Hestia was and where they might be hiding. As the divine king who ruled the world, he could accept that there were places yet to be brought under his dominion, but he couldn't accept the existence of places he did not know about. Sigh. This seems a bit troublesome now. Taking a deep breath, Keto had not expected to encounter this situation. She had indeed been recognized, and although she could deny it, the gods might not necessarily demand evidence. Now she only had two choices. The first was to directly use Asmodeus's power to return to hell. Then the mission of the Lord of the Nine Hells would be deemed a failure, but it would mean that another monarch's mission was completed. The other choice was to stay. After all, Olympus did not forbid gods from having contact with other deities. And during the destruction of the Bronze Age, the divine court had not yet prohibited deities from harvesting the souls of mortals. However, this meant she could no longer use the golden apple to provoke relations among the gods, meaning the mission was still a failure. So, after quickly scanning the assembled gods, Keto's gaze became sharp. If it were just her, then she would have to choose one of these two options, but now, she planned not to choose either. With the golden apple, the things of old weren't so important anymore. Looking at Artemis, who wore the new moon crown in the distance, Keto took out an item from her hand. Your Majesty, the Divine King, whatever happened in the Bronze Age, I'm afraid I didn't violate the rules of the Divine Court at that time. As I remember, it wasn't until after the disaster of Typhon that you helped the gods establish the Divine Kingdom, and only then were human souls forbidden from being taken by each other. What, does your heavenly empress dislike me getting the golden apple so much that now you need to step in and handle this trouble for me? She retorted unapologetically, while Hera stood up fiercely. She was already furious, extremely dissatisfied with Keto getting the golden apple, and now her opponent even dared to provoke her. Keto, do I need Zeus to stand up for me? If you dare to take the golden apple and leave this temple, I will surely make you pay the price in the future. Is that so? Well, I don't believe it. Find exclusive stories on novel.com. With a cold laugh, Keto lightly tossed the item in her hand towards the direction of Artemis. Respected master of the wilderness, do you believe it? Of course not. After hesitating for a moment, Artemis's eyes lit up. She was here to watch the spectacle today anyway, so why not make it even more exciting? Besides, the item Keto handed to her matched her role as the goddess of the wilderness perfectly. If it's beneficial and aligns with her thoughts, then why not go for it? Something is still missing. Chapter 632 to 211, Star Core and Drawing the Sword. An additional 1,000 words were added half an hour after yesterday's update. For your information, this message will be deleted after 1 day. Upon the sea of Pontus Euxinus, thunder exploded. Dense clouds amassed, and fierce winds ravaged the ocean surface. The few passing ships were shattered in an instant, reduced to a trivial speck of dust within the storm. With the seabed earthquake came a roar akin to a titan's bellow, echoing over the open sea. Zeus, what are you waiting for? Aren't you the divine king? Boom, boom, boom. Whoosh. The thunder exploded, and the rain poured down in torrents. The previously cloudless Pontus Euxinus, thanks to the gathering of all gods, turned turbulent and tempestuous in an instant, reflecting the mood of Zeus. The next moment, a silver serpent streaked across the clouds, striking from the sky toward the vast ocean. It seemed to be chasing something, plummeting downward without a moment's hesitation. Gaia is the earth, the sky opposes the earth, while the sea is the earth's basin. And the mountain is the earth's prominence. Thus, the mountain peaks can support the sky, and the bottom of the sea connects with the mainland to the netherworld. Standing atop a tall spire outside the city of Athens, Hermes could almost be certain that the divine king had probably entered the underworld when he saw lightning strike the seabed through his binoculars. He did not know what had transpired there, but seeing this scene, Hermes could largely guess what was about to happen. Hey, just as I thought, not a bit different. I knew it, that shepherd Paris was completely useless. Taking a long breath out, Hermes, the reincarnator in question, moved his eyes away from one end of the binoculars and caressed the observation tool he had created. It seemed to adhere to physical structure and curvature, its form not out of place, for as the pioneer and promulgator of alchemy in this world, Hermes naturally understood the principles of lenses. But this device, which looks like a telescope, functions like a telescope, and has a structure similar to that of a telescope, in reality, does not magnify distant objects, or rather, it's not something that operates on optical principles. It should rather be called the satellite navigation system of the mythic age, and this telescope-like contraption is the device for transmitting and receiving signals. The star core, which fell from a fallen star, is polished into lenses that, under the influence of mysticism, connect with the stars in the sky. Hence, starlight becomes Hermes' eyes and ears, allowing him to see beyond the distant ocean. This is why the gods always prefer to wrap themselves in their power for truly secret discussions in the mythic world, because no one knows how many means there are to spy from a distance. Explore more stories at novel.bin.com. Let's pack it up. With a snap of his fingers, an invisible magical servant immediately came forward to collect the device as he spoke. The sky above was covered with rolling clouds, as if the celestial phenomena from afar were affecting Athens. Of course, Hermes knew it was merely an illusion. But none of these mattered anymore, for the outcome of the feast for the golden apple had been determined. Or rather, from the moment Zeus's priest came to Athens to request a grand assembly, Hermes had already recognized the reality. You see, long ago, he had found the handsome shepherd Paris based on his memory from the future and exerted various subtle influences on him. But even now, although Thetis's wedding had met with an unexpected change, that mortal was still tending to his sheep. No one paid attention to him, and none invited him to choose the owner of the golden apple. Perhaps he still had the chance to become the Prince of Troy in the future, but at least at this moment, he was still living in the pine forest of Mount Ida with his wife. Thus, Hermes confirmed for the umpteenth time that his memories from the future were of little use, even though he had once personally experienced the golden apple incident. But none of the current events seemed to match it. Fortunately, he had found a new direction, quite different from his former self. Knock, knock, knock. Teacher, did you call for me? Yes, Solomon, even though you've just returned from Mycenae, I'm somewhat impatient. How was your trip? How are the things I requested coming along? With a gentle wave of his hand, the door connecting to the top platform of the high tower opened responsively. Hermes was quite pleased as he looked at the apprentice who entered. Dressed in a dark hooded robe and wearing the signature alchemy ring with the emblem of the emerald ring, here stood a young man exceptionally talented among mortals, who had been following him for many years. Even the most excellent alchemist needs assistance, and Solomon had always been doing quite well in that role. Teacher, in the royal palace of Mycenae, I found another 49 star cores, but it requires your inspection to determine if they meet the requirements. The 56 that have been approved are all stored in the vault you asked for. We continue to collect star cores at high prices from various countries, and the aristocrats of Athens have always supported us. However, due to your order to speed up our actions, we've significantly increased our purchase prices, resulting in recent expenditures far exceeding our budget. At this rate, if we continue, our funds will soon run out. The voice came from beneath the hood. The raven-haired, handsome young man spoke with a grave tone. Without looking up, still gazing at the ground before his feet, Solomon brought up their current trouble. Chapter 633-211, Star Core and Drawing the Sword _2. The export of alchemy products has faced resistance. Numerous churches have forcefully seized goods entering foreign lands, claiming these creations are prohibited. Even though the king has opened maritime routes, Silver Moon City itself doesn't lack magic creations, and within the area covered by the maze lock, they don't even use alchemy products. Given our current financial situation, even if we account for credit debts, we can only hold out for another half a year. I understand, I'll figure out the money issue, just continue with the acquisitions. Without paying attention to the lengthy explanations, Hermes made a decision immediately. In this era where gods and mortals coexist and money can buy transcendent materials, he wasn't concerned about how much it cost. However, this time, Solomon, who never usually questioned Hermes' requests, unexpectedly lifted his head and voiced a long-held doubt. Teacher, according to the ratio you choose, only extremely rare star cores are within our acquisition range. If we had a way to distinguish the differences among them. You can't do it. Shaking his head slightly, Hermes responded, only I can discern their differences. I understand, teacher, I spoke out of turn. Bowing to apologize, Hermes simply waved his hand, indicating no harm done. Soon, the two discussed some recent affairs and solved problems Solomon encountered in experiments and meditation. When everything was over, the young Solomon took one last look at his world-famous teacher before closing the metal door behind him upon leaving. Soon, only Hermes remained at the top of the tall tower. As the slight clanging sound of the door echoed, Hermes no longer maintained his dignified demeanor. The former god of travel and theft, who had escaped from the fantasy world, sighed slightly and leaned casually against the railing, scratching his head in annoyance. This progress is still too slow. What a nuisance, I'm still far from the minimal quantity I need. Strictly speaking, the pace of gathering was not slow, since Hermes knew full well that what he was collecting was not merely star cores, but something far more precious. Yet, people are never satisfied. However, there's currently no way to speed up the process. Mass acquisitions had already made some ignorant people clutch their purses, refusing to sell anymore. Indeed, as Solomon said, if he possessed the ability to discern which star cores met the criteria, the entire collection process would be faster and more accurate. Yet Hermes knew well that saying he alone could distinguish these from ordinary star cores wasn't due to any selfish cherishing of his secrets, but because this wasn't some special technique or magic, but a fundamental ability possessed by a god or former god. A god can recognize another god, there's nothing strange about that. This isn't something that can be taught, at least not by Hermes right now. If it really comes down to it, I might have to return to my old trade. If I don't sort this out quickly, I really won't feel secure. Apollo now is the god of sun, he should have a good quantity. Tisk. Back then I stole his cattle, now it seems times have changed. Curling his lip, the renowned god of thieves thought of his exploits in the fantasy world. Even as a baby, he had shown initiative by stealing sacrifices intended for Apollo, and now, it seemed his first job in the real world might again involve Apollo. One might say they were fatefully linked. Hermes secretly decided, if he really went through with it, he would definitely leave a gift for Apollo. To be fair, aside from the emotional issues common to the chaotic gods, Hermes quite admired him. That settles it, for safety. Feigning encouragement, but Hermes meant this quite earnestly. He did all this not because of any ambition, at least not up to this point, it was all just for safety. After all, ever since that great hand squashed the entire fantasy world into a pie, he had been feeling somewhat insecure. At the Sea of Pontus Euxinus, the place Hermes had just been observing. Boom! With a thunderous roar, the figure of the divine king had already vanished, leaving only the golden throne suspended in midair. Poseidon, what are you ranting about? Experience new stories on Novel Bin.com. With a worried expression, Hestia was already somewhat angry. But facing the scolding of his elder sister, Poseidon, who had been somewhat silent at the wedding, was even angrier than she was. My sister, I followed your arrangements and advice, overlooking Zeus's breach of his own promise, and came to the sea to arrange the wedding. I think I have been restrained enough. But I never knew that my friends had found other suitors long ago and only I knew nothing. What, shouldn't I have let Zeus learn about that strange and powerful deity? Or do you mean to say that you would only be satisfied if another disaster like Typhon acted out at sea? At a loss for words, Hestia knew that neither side was wrong, the issue was merely the occasion and standpoint. For Poseidon, he didn't have an entire divine system to support him like Zeus did. His only followers were the primordial sea god lineage that had gathered around him since the change of eras. Zeus's forceful interference in the marriage of Thetis due to the prophecy had already made Poseidon wary. He felt that the divine king had finally set his sights on the power of the sea. So at the previous wedding, he had remained silent the whole time, allowing the weary sea empress Amphitrite to participate in the conflict over the golden apple. Now it seemed he had thought too simply, Zeus hadn't had the chance to do anything, and it turned out that the primordial sea god lineage had already secretly contacted other existences. From the standpoint of the divine court, this really wasn't a principal issue. The goddess of life as the principal god had once been a follower of the Lord of Darkness. But for Poseidon, this was decidedly intolerable. So he wanted Zeus to resolve this issue, in front of all the gods, and indeed Zeus did go. But in Hestia's eyes, the divine king should not be leaving at this very moment. And just as she thought, the next moment, heavenly empress Hera let out a cold laugh. She was not concerned about Poseidon or Zeus in the slightest, but instead stretched her hand into the void, and arrows of thunder appeared directly in her grasp. As the heavenly empress who shared power, she was one of only 2 deities who could summon this divine artifact. And with the artifact in hand, feeling the immense power, Hera fiercely hurled it forward. Arrows of thunder shot through the air, pointing directly at Artemis and Keto. The latter's power was far less than Hera's, and having lost some of the Lord of the Nine Hells' strength residing in her, Keto was also unlikely to block this strike. The recent choice regarding the golden apple seemed to have turned into waste paper. Hera's actions undeniably proved that she intended to resolve the issue through force. The trajectory of the divine artifact reflected in the eyes of goddess Artemis, who knew she was no match, yet she still clenched her teeth slightly, drawing bow and readying arrow. And then, the next moment, the only shield in the world that could counteract thunder was placed between them. Chapter 634 to 212 3 parts. Arrows of thunder, the divine weapon formed from Zeus's authority. Although with the breakthrough of the true god's boundary, this once glorious divine artifact was no longer as useful to the divine king as it had been, it remained a powerful weapon. As one of the few high-grade artifacts specializing in combat, Hera holding the thunder felt confident enough to confront any deity. However, at this moment, the heavenly empress's furious blow could not make any progress against a small sheepskin shield. The sharp essence couldn't pierce the leather, and the scattered thunder trembled before the eye like patterns before solidifying into substance, turning into tiny pebbles that fell to the ground. That was the shield of Aegis, a divine artifact born alongside Athena. Its appearance was so unremarkable, and in fact, its power was not particularly strong among divine artifacts. Even though 1,000 years ago Aegis had been lent to Zeus's son, the whale player, Perseus, and had absorbed Medusa's petrification ability to strengthen itself during his adventure, the foundation of this artifact was ultimately just an ordinary sheepskin to the deities. Therefore, this artifact, which specialized in defense, had hardly ever demonstrated its power. Be it Athena's own spear of victory or the goddess of justice Themis's sword of judgment, they could all inflict damage on Aegis. There was one exception, that was, when facing thunder. Even though there was a huge difference in power between the 2 artifacts, Aegis still firmly blocked the lightning, preventing it from advancing further. Bang! Said at a slow pace, but occurring swiftly. The twang of a bowstring resonated through the thunder. The deep purple lightning was blocked behind the shield, while Artemis with the bow drawn precisely seized this opportunity. In the myths of later generations, the divine king had prepared a golden bow and a silver bow for his pair of children. Apollo received the latter, with which he shot down the serpent Typhon, leaving behind the reputation of a god of long-range shooting, whereas Artemis acquired the former, being worshipped by hunters in the name of the goddess of hunting. In this world, Artemis may have lost the golden bow, but she gained a moon bow. The new moon is the crescent, the new moon crown can also become the crescent bow. The gift from Keto, now in the hands of the master of the wilderness, turned into arrows in her grasp and surged towards Hera with strength. Swish! A streak of light flashed in the sky, and the distance within the great hall seemed non-existent before the divine bow and arrows. Among the Olympian gods, only Hestia, who managed to react hastily, raised a barrier in front of her. However, in the blink of an eye, the arrow shattered the goddess's defense and aimed straight for the brow of the heavenly empress. Hiss! Ah! A cry of pain. The goddess of Hearthfire's action was ultimately not in vain. Hera still made a response. She turned her head, trying to dodge the deadly arrow. However, as the arrow grazed past her cheek, it left a vivid trail of blood. The wound was not deep, but it dealt Hera a heavy blow both physically and emotionally. Feeling the warmth scraping past her cheek, the heavenly empress was uncontrollable in her fury. Athena, how dare you! Rage accumulated in her chest, making her voice shrill and piercing. The arrow that had grazed by spun back into its master's hand, yet at this moment, Hera's gaze full of hatred was directed not at Artemis but at Athena. Since becoming the heavenly empress, Hera had been wounded by only two beings in thousands of years. One was Typhon, whose immense and dreadful strength still instilled deep fear in Hera's heart. And the other was Athena before her eyes right now. She had never truly taken action, but yet everything seemed to be related to her. The power of the outer god that had eroded through the sacrificial channel not so long ago was one such instance, and now Artemis was the same. Enjoy more content from novel bin.com. Athena, you offspring of Métis remaining after her death. How dare you still be here? How dare you commit such an offense against the heavenly empress of the divine court? Athena, do you think you're invincible now? Anger clouded her judgment, and Métis' name had always been taboo for Zeus. He never wanted others to mention her, but at this moment, Hera had clearly forgotten this. Indeed, ha ha ha. Well said, Hera, you've finally shown some backbone. But it makes sense, facing any woman other than Zeus, you always seem very tough, ha ha ha. Wild laughter sounded, as Poseidon, who was the first to initiate earlier, stepped forward with large strides. Previously, as the Human Realm Congress unfolded, clouds gathered in the sky, and a great rain brewed over the city-states. Every perceptive deity assumed these were displays of the divine king's displeasure, but they had nothing to do with Zeus at all. How could he not foresee the possible consequences of changing the subject himself? This was actually the wrath of Poseidon. Zeus had bypassed the wedding he had arranged for the sea nymph Thetis, and he had endured, as the true god who had unleashed the deluge that ended the Bronze Age. He still endured while mortals questioned the justice of the divine court. But now, in Zeus's absence, no one could suppress Poseidon by force any longer. The Lord of the Storm who could shake the earth could no longer tolerate any possible rebellion from the line of the ancient sea gods. Deeming himself the Sea Emperor, Poseidon brandished his trident, pointing from afar at Artemis and Keto, shielded by the shield of Aegis. Keto, show yourself. And you, my dear niece, you've won Athens from me. And you let that vile mortal run amok on the open sea. I've long wanted to see your capabilities. Come, this ridiculous shield won't stop me. Chapter 635 to 212 3 parts _2. In the blink of an eye, Pontus's former palace had almost turned into a battlefield, with the stances of Poseidon and Hera clearly displayed. Witnessing this scene, Phoebe's gaze flickered uncertainly. The situation had developed to a point where it was almost impossible for her to obtain the golden apple, but the arrow just fired by Artemis had stirred something in her heart. As the goddess of luminous, she actually had a direct path above a true god. Like a complete ocean, if she could subdue the sun, moon, and stars, and become the true supreme of luminous entities, that would suit her godhood better than being the most beautiful goddess. Previously, this was merely a fantasy, as the sun was an insurmountable problem for her. But now, Apollo was her grandson, and their relationship was good. As for the moon, looking at the new moon crown, Phoebe struggled internally. However, the gods in the arena were not going to stop because of her hesitation. When Poseidon's deal fell through, Artemis's bow was drawn again, and further away, Aphrodite was covering her face, glaring fiercely at Keto. Ares, seeing this, was overjoyed. He no longer had to hesitate between his wife and the mother goddess, especially since the enemy was Athena. He happily drew his bronze sword and stood beside Poseidon. However, the Sea Emperor glanced disdainfully at his approach, subtly distancing himself. It wasn't that he was rash, but rather that he couldn't always control his emotions, though most of the time he was aware of the consequences. Ares, however, was different. He probably didn't mean to anger the two goddesses, but seeing his delighted expression, Poseidon himself felt like beating him. At this moment, the deities within the Great Hall seemed to be divided into three factions, two in opposition and one neutral. Apollo and Leto stood aside. Zephyrus remained loyal to Zeus and had no intention of getting involved. The goddess of life, Moanda, observed from the sidelines, while the goddess of agriculture was indecisive. She despised Poseidon but disliked Athens in the mortal realm as well, so she and Hestia stood together, likewise withdrawing from the contest. Near the principal seat in the temple, Nereus was pondering the situation, but his brother, the Fury of the Sea, Phorcys, had already made a decision and stood by Keto. Like Keto of old, he had a visage that did not fit in with the other gods. Known as the father of monsters, he didn't care about what Nereus thought. Before Pontus's eldest son had a chance to scold his brother for making his own decision, the miracle of the sea, Hermes, had already made a choice himself. He came to Hera's side, willing to fight for her because his daughter, the rainbow goddess Iris, had been a messenger during the titanomachy of Zeus and had later become Hera's envoy. The gods quickly picked sides, and the vast divine court seemed to be cleft into several factions. As she held Selene's hand, Hecate's smile became increasingly radiant. She had not joined the side with Keto, of course, she was not going to join the other side either. After all, strictly speaking, she didn't have many close interactions with Athena. She was merely watching everything with interest, increasingly feeling that her trip today had not been in vain. So, Selene, who do you think will win, or rather, how many can Athena take down? The pleasure in her voice was unmistakable, and the moon goddess puffed out her cheeks in response. It'd be best not to fight. Fighting is meaningless. Don't say that, it's quite rare. Huh? Suddenly, Hecate's gaze was caught by a small figure. He was a cripple, a rarity among the divine, yet he possessed a mechanical contraption that served as a replacement for his leg. Stepping forward slowly under Hera's nearly fiery gaze, he positioned himself beside Athena. Is that Hephaestus? I remember he was brought to Mount Olympus by Zeus after the disaster of Typhon. Seemingly Hera's son, yet they shared some discontent. Surprisingly, he now stands by her opponent. What is this, some kind of unconventional courtship? Tisk. Whatever it is, I'm certain Athena wouldn't be interested in him. Discover exclusive tales on novel bin.com. The volcano and craftsman god, the most low-key, least sociable, and least noticeable principal god of Olympus. Many argue his divine status as principal god was solely due to his maternal connection with Hera, yet their relationship appeared discordant. Regardless, the unsightly god quietly made his way to Athena's side, and Athena, who had kept her seat from beginning to end, sighed upon seeing this, a trace of helplessness finally emerging on her youthful face. One does not slap a smiling face. The other party had not yet done what he had in the fantasy world, so it wasn't right for Athena to attack him. It has come to this, after all. A trace of mockery crossed her perfect face, and Athena's expression gradually turned serious. As someone who had seen the script, she had anticipated the affair with the golden apple and had also gleaned some of Zeus's intentions. If she had wanted, today might not have reached this point. She was confident she could persuade Artemis not to get involved in Keto's affairs and was also capable of skillfully distancing herself from the implications of the golden apple. As long as Zeus continued to play within the rules with her, she would always have a way to refuse his moves. But as the goddess of wisdom, Athena also knew well that rules were always meant to maintain dominance, not objectively exist. They would only be upheld by their creator if the benefits of their existence outweighed their absence. For Zeus, what was the greatest benefit? Probably ruling all things and increasing in power. Thus, she allowed Artemis to go ahead and merely watched as the situation unfolded. Since the decision of Zeus was inevitable, she could only choose the best moment to deal with his move. The only force that could counter great divine power was another great divine power. And she wasn't sure if the Lord of the Spirit Realm cared about the conflicts of the mortal realm. However, now it seemed there was another entity behind Keto, deeply interested in meddling in human affairs. Hell? In Athena's perception, Andrea possessed a similar kind of power. After all, she was her practitioner of godhood. When they stood together in the same palace, she naturally recognized the other's identity. The other party's intention to intervene in the mortal realm might be for faith. Or something else, and having no power there, he wanted to stir up conflict, expand his influence, and even recruit allies, and Athens might be one of the targets. Indecision leads to chaos. Athena wasn't sure if this was the best timing, but it certainly wasn't the worst. She needed to respond. Thus, she rose from her seat, her gaze sweeping over all gods. Then let it begin. Slowly she spoke as her dress transformed into armor. She grasped the spear in her hand, its tip pointing towards Hera's direction. Chapter 636-213, Double Kings. As contradictions fermented within the palace atop the ocean, deep below, in the underworld. A pale purple moon illuminated the ashen soil, impervious to the influences of the mortal realm. Almost the moment Hera clasped the thunder to strike the sheepskin shield, a silver serpent flashed across the doorway to the underworld. Eternal night and darkness enveloped both sides, the ceaseless river of sorrow churning with waves. Due to the unique spatial rules of the underworld, no matter from where one came above ground, they would always arrive at the same entrance. Thus, Hades had built a gateway, dividing the mortal realm from the underworld. And at that moment, no living creature stood before this grand door, only a man clad in black armor, his complexion pale, leaning on his sword. Beside him, souls undulated with the flow of the Styx River. Of course, calling him a human was only an appearance. Only Zeus could ascertain he was no deity, but whether he was truly human was quite doubtful. Aegis. Emerging from a blaze of lightning, after many years, the divine king once again stepped into this savage land as viewed by all gods. For some reason, Zeus felt something had changed here, but after sensing around, he came up with nothing. He shook his head slightly, casting aside the illusion. Perhaps it was an impact from previously dealing with the invasion of an outer god. The real reason Zeus stopped was not this illusion, but rather the clash between thunder and the sheepskin shield far out on the ocean. Falling from the sky for 9 days and 9 nights, one reaches the earth, from the earth falling 9 days and 9 nights, one reaches the netherworld. But this immense distance seemed not so vast for Zeus now. Standing here, he could still feel his own divine artifact. Hera had used it and then it was easily blocked by the shield of Aegis. Although it was a bolt of thunder he had left intentionally and he had known all along it could not trouble Athena, Zeus still felt somewhat uncomfortable seeing the artifact. Once cherished so deeply by himself, rendered so powerless. Experience tales at novel bin. Calm. His subtle fear of Athena came just like this, not overnight, but over centuries, each time she silently demonstrated her capability. Fortunately, she was a goddess. Thinking no further, Zeus felt he should adjust his attitude. Looking at Erebus, he never had these backward-looking concerns. Although this also had to do with the power of primordial gods not being as replaceable as the throne of God King. Zeus still felt he had something to learn. Halt, who goes there? As thoughts fluttered through his mind, it all took but a moment outside. When Zeus's form materialized at the doorway of the underworld, a loud shout resounded across both banks of the Styx River. The man holding a heavy sword raised his head, his eyes beneath the mask piercing and bright. A profound and frigid aura was released from him, filling the ashen wilderness. And being interrogated, Zeus was surprised to discover that this seemingly non-living being possessed quasi-godly power. Even among true gods he was not weak. Zagreus, a gatekeeper Hades had found from somewhere, possessing a more potent undying physique than a normal divine body, yet not a demigod. I had thought this was just a rumor. The corner of Zeus's lips twitched as he remembered the other's presence. Zephyrus had brought up this matter, but speaking of it, as the king of the underworld, Hades was quite fitting. After all, he always liked dealing with dead things. With a light smile, Zeus did not conceal his divine identity. I am the divine king of Olympus, as well as the king of the sky, ocean, and earth. Step aside, I am entering the underworld, this is my rightful privilege. The silent, unceremoniously inspecting man named Zagreus then silently moved to clear the path. The armor plates clinked crisply against each other, sounding off clear metal on metal collisions. Although displeased with Zagreus's attitude, considering he was a subordinate of Hades, Zeus said nothing. Soon, he had agreed to Erebus's proposal to stir up the conflict for the golden apple in order to change this status quo. It wouldn't be long before everything changed. Paying no heed to this tactless individual, Zeus effortlessly crossed past the place guarded by Zagreus, passed over the river of sorrow, and then generally identified the direction. Earlier, he had tracked across oceans and earth layers following that aura, but upon reaching the underworld, he suddenly lost track of it. It seemed as if melded into the underworld itself. The aura vanished without a trace, but Zeus quickly understood why. The underworld had originated from the mingling domains of the 4 primordial gods, so in theory, the power of all 4 primordial deities could achieve this feat. However, Erebus had just reached an agreement with him. Nyx was a suspect but unlikely. If the search proved fruitless, he might try confirming by paying a visit to this most low-profile primordial god. The rest was also possible. Gaia was still the earth god. So logically, this should be related to Tartarus. Yes, a logical deduction. Besides, a god unseen in the present world likely originated from the chaotic abyss. An answer was found, but Zeus felt increasingly troubled. Tartarus, a place outside the present world. There, his power as divine king was bound to be greatly suppressed and weakened. Chapter 637-213, Twin Kings _2. The Abyss. He muttered the name under his breath, hesitating for a moment. Although instinctively a bit repulsed, Zeus set out once again. It wasn't that he decided to pursue the mastermind behind Keto because of something Poseidon said. Rather, he left on his own accord to give the gods some slack, and, incidentally, to avoid trouble. But that didn't mean Zeus lost interest in discovering who that entity was. That familiar feeling, he had definitely encountered them before. Though he couldn't remember where he had seen them, he still wanted to find out. Suddenly, his figure shifted, and as the surrounding environment gradually distorted, an existent, yet non-existent, winding portal appeared before Zeus. Tartarus, a place he had entered before he became the divine king. Back then, he was still striving to overthrow his own father. Standing once again at its threshold today, Zeus keenly felt how things had changed. Come, let me see who you really are. Taking a deep breath, Zeus stepped forward. Soon, with a distortion of time and space, his figure was no longer under the underworld's sky. In the depths of hell, on a high mountain range, within a continuous stretch of palaces, Asmodeus just withdrew the power he had extended. Stay updated with novel bin. This power residing in Keto didn't function to substitute fights but only declared its presence when facing beings of the same level. Thus, it swiftly returned to the abyss after making its existence felt. However, unlike what Zeus believed, as once said, when the demon gods were born in Tartarus, the time-space of the 9 hells rose up within the abyss. So, in reality, he didn't traverse the abyss's gate, but the moment he entered the underworld, he was already back here. Have you followed me here? Leaving at this time? Just as I suspected, you also want to stir up conflict? This timing, this somewhat premature preparation, the abnormal fluctuations of the world power, and that goddess of life. So you've reached an agreement with darkness, aiming to fully unify the present world through this opportunity. Asmodeus slightly lifted his hand, catching strands of dark power in his open palm. This was the power entrenched in the soul of the Silver Generation by Erebus, which later became spoils of war for the 9 hells. Granting the demons' clan power over the shadows. Thinking about this power, recalling his cooperation with Gaia, the Lord of Darkness, and considering Zeus's personality. What can I say other than everyone has their own schemes? Clenching his hand, Asmodeus extinguished the strand of power and turned to look around his abode. Different from the central court's floating island in the 5th layer of hell, the 9th layer of purgatory closely resembled the mortal realm. The construction of hell originated from the order in chaos. And naturally, the 9th layer was the most orderly among them. Even from a mortal's perspective, they might not discern the difference between this place and the outside world, thinking they were still in the mortal realm and not a lower world filled with blood and fire. The 9th layer of hell, Chronoia, if the old Titans' deities were here, they would perhaps be startled to find how similar these towering mountains and the yet uncollapsed Mount Ophrys were, and how the cluster of buildings at the mountain top hardly differed from those of the past. Do you miss the past that much, or is it, perhaps, the reason you incite conflicts in the mortal realm? The voice came from far across the depths of space and time, and Asmodeus was not surprised by the ancient serpent's belated inquiry. When he learned that the orders received by Keto had been changed, he knew the other party would come asking. And his response had been prepared in that very moment. It's nostalgia indeed, but I do not miss the place per se. In fact, I only miss that version of myself. Fervent in spirit, with my wife by my side, protected by loyal guards. This is why I want to return, and why I must shatter the divine court and seek revenge against Zeus and fate. But what about you? Why do you seek to halt this contradiction? In reality, you have no reason to stop me, and Zeus is not a match for me now. Even if he wielded greater power, as the divine king, his authority is constrained by the mortal world. So why halt his attempt to stir up internal strife in his own divine court? Or even directly order Keto? His expression was calm, although completely unaware of Hemenu's world. Asmodeus still made the most precise judgment. You are entangled, and you've encountered unexpected events. Due to the former, you can no longer sit aloft and watch the world change, because as the most crucial point, your power has been limited. Due to the latter, you had to order Keto, as there wasn't enough time to think, and you could find no better candidate to complete your task. So you see an opportunity? His voice was serene. The ancient serpent did not appear angered. Asmodeus was not his subordinate, a fact long known. So, the other's choice was unexpected yet within reason. Yes, this is the best opportunity. The war between hell and the abyss is destined to continue for endless years, for the world is expanding. As the core of chaos, Tartarus's power is being consumed by me, but it is also growing in itself. Only in the mortal realm, where Zeus seeks to stir up conflict. Even threatening your arrangement, you're unable to use full strength, but here I am, aren't I? Rather than paying a price in the future to oppose Zeus together, isn't it better now? Look, no matter what, at least for now, our interests in the mortal realm align. Stretching out his hand, Asmodeus drew a sickle from the void. It looked very much like the one he had before, but even more refined and splendid. The Lord of the Nine Hells stepped forward, coming before the gates of the abyss outside hell. This is as far as you go, Zeus. He chuckled softly, then swung the sickle. Chapter 638 to 214, The Second Fracture of the Body. Not long ago, he had just crossed the threshold of the abyss. He appeared calm as he surveyed his surroundings, but in reality, Zeus felt somewhat bewildered, thinking he might have come to the wrong place. However, after a dizzying swirl, as the chaotic space-time regained calm, the environment around him had drastically transformed into another world. In Zeus's original impression, the abyss was directionless and orderless, as well as devoid of chaos. In the past, he had wandered here with a trace of divine authority, moving forward 1 second and backward the next, or even just spinning in place. Even so, he and his brothers had kept advancing in Tartarus at that time. But at this moment, a different world unfolded before Zeus. The dark red earth stretched endlessly, mountains and yellow rivers flowed across the land, the soil seemingly soaked with blood and flesh. Emitting a faint stench, some beings clad in scales, with sharp claws and horns, roamed and fought on the earth, devouring each other to grow stronger. They seemed naturally attuned to the chaotic order of the abyss, enhancing themselves by plundering others. In the sky above this realm, a red celestial body radiated light, illuminating the entire world. It wasn't the sun. Zeus quickly discerned that it was a special celestial body composed of fire and molten lava. But no matter what it was utterly out of line with his past impressions of the abyss. If it weren't for the familiar suppression and isolation of godly authority by Tartarus, Zeus might have thought a fluctuation in space-time was the issue, that he had merely arrived at some corner of the present world. But now, soaring into the sky, Zeus observed this world. And as he looked down from high above, a piece of information abruptly and somehow became accessible to him. This is the first layer of the abyss. Layer 0011, the myriad abyss planes. What is this? The abyss has been divided into layers, and they are even numbered. And the myriad abyss planes, what is that? For a moment, an onslaught of consecutive information made Zeus feel as if he was in a dream. He didn't know what was going on, but Zeus still remembered why he had come. He briefly sensed the space-time of this world, resilient yet full of faults. It was easy to find a way to tear through it. Then the next moment, something caught Zeus's attention. In the distant void, a portal abruptly opened. Soon, an army that seemed majestic slowly emerged from it, with hundreds of thousands of lives of various appearances gathered together. At the very center, a two-headed giant gripped the space-time passage, his head peeking through to the other side. Looking around, the giant seemed to be assessing the environment. Then the next moment, he noticed Zeus floating in midair. Stare. 6 eyes locked in gaze. The flying Zeus and the other were almost at the same height. After noticing each other's presence, both clearly seemed taken aback. Zeus couldn't help but ponder again what kind of place he had arrived at, whether the 3 male Hecatonchera had left offspring in the abyss. Meanwhile, the two-headed giant was also greatly surprised. This aura, so out of sync with the abyss, neither the left head nor the right had ever encountered such a thing. Left. Hey, what is this? I don't think I've ever seen such a life form before. Right, I don't know, it looks like a human? I've heard of the name, they say it's a sneaky kind of alien clan. But whatever it is, I haven't eaten one yet, might as well try it out now. Left, really, but he doesn't look very tasty, and his aura makes me feel sick. I want to smash him into a meat pie. Right, no way, I want to try eating him, you can't lay a finger on him. Stay connected through novel bin, calm. Left, why not? If you say no, I want to crush him even more. Boom. Thoughts communicating far faster than words. In Zeus's eyes, the momentarily stunned two-headed giant suddenly erupted in anger, looking furious and fully intimidating. And with the intermittent amplification of the abyss, the opponent's strength was indeed formidable, although no threat to Zeus, yet certainly extraordinary. Then the next moment, the giant's right hand thumped his chest, looking like he was issuing a challenge, while the other hand swept through the air, striking directly at Zeus. What is it? Can it not gauge the disparity between us? With a frown, Zeus was prepared to strike down his opponent on the spot with full force, but he hesitated. This was, after all, the abyss, and the opponent's body was faintly bolstered by the power of the abyss, just as he had been bolstered in the realms of Asgard. In such a situation, killing the opponent rashly might not be wise. So scanning the surrounding space for a moment, Zeus surged forward. The space shattered, and his figure disappeared amidst the myriad abyss planes. Ah, the food has run away. Seeing Zeus's figure vanish, the right head of the giant felt somewhat disappointed. Yeah, the meat pie ran away. Nodding, the left head seemed to forget that the other had just been preventing him from acting, and also expressed agreement. Forget it, it's gone. What were we about to do? Idiot, we were about to massacre those demons. We were headed for the Asura field. Disdainfully cursing, the right head shouted loudly, "Move out, enlist all demons along the way. To kill, to advance. Hey, we are one and the same, only an idiot would call themselves an idiot. Move out, kill kill kill." Regardless, the two heads reached a consensus on this point. Thus, this brief interlude as if it had never occurred, resuming the interrupted march across the myriad abyss planes, tightly linked with several layers of the abyss and adjacent to the hells. And just like every demon army that had passed before, their ultimate destination was the place known as the Blood War battlefield. The Asura field. Crack, crack, crackle. In the void of the abyss, space-time trembled. Unlike in the past, the abyssal demon lords could once roam freely here and strike at the location of the 9 hells, but now, as the layers of the abyss gradually became more established and expanded, this void, which carried many layers, was no longer accessible. It wouldn't be long before, just like in the present world, the numerous layers filled up space-time here, making it impossible even for Zeus to come here. But now, with a sound of breaking space, the divine king still appeared. Looking back at where he came from, the first layer of the abyss was positioned above, horizontally obscuring the vast void in Tartarus. It was like a small bubble in a giant air bubble, yet continuously growing and expanding. Below, countless bubbles densely packed the space-time position. Witnessing this, Zeus was shocked while simultaneously feeling that he had uncovered a colossal secret. So that's how it is. No wonder I never had any intelligence on that mysterious existence. The abyss is actually like this. Wait, what about Creus, whom I had previously incarcerated here? Having suddenly realized a blind spot, Zeus felt as if he had become aware of something he had previously overlooked. An idea flashed through his mind, and he was about to ponder it carefully. However, the next moment, a premonition of alarm surged in his heart. Who is there? His thought process was interrupted, and Zeus had no time to regret it. He instinctively took a defensive stance, yet what caught his eyes was indeed a blade light that streaked across from the distant end of space-time. However, by now, Zeus was also battle-hardened, even having literally fought head-on with the mighty Typhon. Even if he lost the advantage and was suppressed by the power of the abyss, he couldn't possibly be ambushed by such simple tactics, unless there was something else that could disturb his mind. Impossible! An incredible shout erupted as Zeus saw a sickle, all too familiar to him, slashing through the air. He had clashed with this sickle's owner more than once, during the most dangerous yet most confident times. At that time, he hadn't yet become the divine king, but the entire world stood by his side, and he firmly believed he would win. But why would this sickle appear here? Wasn't it supposed to have retired into seclusion with the mother goddess Rhea, never to appear again? Rip. Ah. His mind was disturbed again. Though Zeus tried his best to parry in the next moment, two errors had ultimately made the situation irretrievable. As the sound of flesh being torn erupted, Zeus's thigh was directly severed. However, the real reason for Zeus's scream wasn't just that, but also because something else very close to his thigh had also been chopped in half. Ah, damn it, no, you are not him. This isn't that sickle. Ah, who are you? His eyes bloodshot, his voice furious. If it were any other deity, the reaction might not have been so severe, but this was Zeus. Mere pain couldn't defeat this third-generation divine king, but only Zeus knew the extent of the psychological blow he had received in that moment. A similar appearance, a familiar path of the blade, it almost led Zeus to believe that he was facing the divine artifact that had ended the first divine king. Even though he knew he didn't possess the divine authority of a progenitor, facing this sickle, he still feared he could meet the same fate as Uranus. What scared him the most was that in that instant, his inner answer was, "It won't happen." Even if this sickle could permanently sever a part of him, he wouldn't eternally rest like the Heavenly Father. As for the reason, because during the turmoil instigated by Typhon, he had already found himself here once. But the fake was ultimately fake. When Zeus came to his senses, he noticed the differences in the figure before him from the one he remembered. For a deity, authority is the most direct way to recognize someone. And in front of Zeus, this figure wielding the sickle showed no hint of the divine authority formerly possessed by that man. Moreover, even if the sickle appeared similar, the moment Zeus roared, he calmed down slightly. This person is deliberately provoking me, purposely mimicking the past, deliberately crafting a weapon in its likeness. Yes, I must stay calm. He may imitate external objects, but he cannot mimic authority. You ask who I am? Isn't it obvious? Under the black robe, the smile of the Lord of the Nine Hells remained. He knew, once his fate, body, authority, and true name had all been altered, the other party would never recognize him as his past self. Perhaps others might notice from the details, but Zeus wouldn't. So without lies, without covering up, Asmodeus raised the sickle again, laughing as he spoke. Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, the third king of all gods. I am your most respected father, a father educating his son. Is this not reasonable? You're courting death, so much for calm, so much for provocation. At this moment, Zeus didn't care about his severed body. As the flesh on his left leg continued to regenerate, Zeus stepped forward on one leg. Your strength is no greater than mine, yet you dare to provoke me like this. A father, is it? Then, like during the war with the Titans, I'll fight, a father, once again. Chapter 639-215, The Deal. Emotions drove actions, without any superfluous communication. Zeus stretched out his hand and gripped. Then in the void, a ghostly long spear slowly solidified and was held in his hand. The aura emanating from the body of the spear was strong and ancient, but it was not a true divine artifact. Of course, for deities who had reached this stage, ordinary divine artifacts were of little use anyway. Just as Laine often used the power of death from the well of reincarnation to transform into a black sword, the long spear in Zeus's hand was also an embodiment of Asgard's power, one of the symbols of his sovereign. He opened up the divine domain, allowing all gods to build divine kingdoms, which in itself was a behavior that aligned with a sovereign's gathering of the masses. Hence, the Asgard divine domain was subtly changed to align more with the sovereign's authority. Perhaps a million years later, just like the scepter forged by the second-generation divine king, if there really was a next generation of divine king, Asgard might also be one of the things passed down to the successor. But all that was a matter for later. Holding the long spear, Zeus locked onto his opponent. Just like the shape of the long spear, which was the weapon of Asgard's previous master, the divine lance called Gingnir, which guaranteed hits. This imitation bestowed upon it certain characteristics that made its attacks difficult to evade. Whoosh! The long spear cleaved through the air, piercing the void. As a manifestation of divine domain power, it was like a world pressing down at the speed of light. If it had been in the outside world, such a strike would have made the earth sink and the stars tremble. However, this was the abyss, and Tartarus had enough power to contain such destruction brought by outsiders to its environment. Therefore, the supreme power was confined around the spear as it followed a mysterious trajectory towards the Lord of the Nine Hells. Naturally, what met the body of the spear was that blood-stained sickle. Clang! A crisp ringing sound as the blade collided with the spear. The next moment, vast power burst forth from their point of contact, tearing and reconstituting the laws of the void. However, it was quite evident that Zeus seemed to be at a disadvantage. His conjured spear directly shattered at the tip, although it reformed in the next moment. The outcome was still clear. How is this possible? No, it's the abyss. He was stunned for a moment, then Zeus suddenly realized. In theory, although he did not know the specifics of the opponent's strength, there should not be a huge gap between them according to the sensation from the divine authority. But the reality at hand made him realize that although the abyss also repelled hell, at his own doorstep, Asmodeus's power was still more fully exerted, unlike Zeus's. He was a true outsider, and also the one Tartarus sought to repel. Even so, feeling the difference in power, Zeus found it hard to accept. In such a place, was there actually another being capable of contending with him? Before his ascension, he had plenty of powerful enemies. After his ascension, there were still plenty. If it continued like this, wasn't his ascension in vain? You think geographical advantage can stop me? Dream on. Bang! Unwilling to retreat, but under the abyss's suppression, he truly was at a loss against the opponent before him. Then the next moment, with a roar, Zeus's figure burst open, then expanded 1,000 times over. He glared at Asmodeus ahead, his hands raised high towards the sky. As if shouldering the celestial sphere, the titanic deity declared war on the laws of the abyss. Come! The suppression of the abyss was too strong, and he could not exert his power at all, so what to do? Then, for the time being, he would borrow power from another world to fight it. Thus the power of Asgard flowed forth, converging between the raised hands of Zeus. The world's shadow emerged there, and as the image appeared, not only was another strike from the Lord of the Nine Hells blocked, but the suppression of the abyss was also briefly weakened. The price, though, was Asgard's power visibly draining away. I don't care, tools only have value when they are used. Taking a big step forward, Zeus recalled the unforgettable figure from the time of the epical transition. His vast form became even more immense, and without the barrier of interface power, the full symbol of his sovereignty was revealed for the first time in this world. Come, now let's see, who is the victor? Clenching his fists into a hammer, he struck down fiercely. And standing opposite Zeus, the Lord of the Nine Hells stood as immovable as a mountain. Drinking poison to quench thirst, how much longer can you hold on? Well then, I'll indulge you. Let's see how much of your reserves you can deplete before you calm down, Asmodeus said while facing off against Zeus for a long time and having learned to be precise and calculating when dealing with discrepancies in scale. So at this moment, watching Zeus, who was liberal with his resources, he felt a touch of nostalgia but did not hesitate to take advantage. Power in itself doesn't vanish. If not used now, it would be employed in the future. To drain some of it early was naturally a good thing. In the abyss, battle erupted, and upon the sea, a column of light pierced the sky, heralding the unsurprising outbreak of war among the gods. At the onset of the conflict, Keto sought Aphrodite without hesitation. There was no hatred between them, only the clash of interests brought about by power. Yet for deities, this was a far more intolerable dispute than any other. Elsewhere, Phoebe, the goddess of luminous, finally joined the battle, cloaking herself in a righteous cause. She believed that Artemis, as the daughter of the divine king, her own granddaughter, shouldn't be left to wander in the wild. She claimed that the other should travel to the stars to meet her grandfather. However, Artemis only responded to Phoebe's proposals with her bow and arrows. In terms of divine power, although the sun, moon, and stars no longer obeyed commands 3 eras later, the goddess of luminous had benefited from the expansion of the world, attaining a divine power level close to 18. By contrast, as a new goddess, even with the existence of the power of faith, Artemis was at a disadvantage in divine strength. However, the role of divine artifacts was evident in the clashes of true gods, and Artemis had not only acquired the new moon crown but also transformed another gift from Keto into a divine artifact in her hands. It was nothing else but the powers related to sea monsters and wildness that Keto, once the mother of sea monsters, had shed from her old form. Such power was of little significance to the reborn Keto, but it was perfectly aligned with Artemis as the master of the wilderness. Combined, they stood off against Phoebe as in the divine battles of the previous era, with no victor likely to emerge in short order. The other deities each had their own battlefields, with frequent clashes above the Sea of Pontus Euxinus. And, without a doubt, the true focal point for the spectating gods was the fight at the center. The trident, thunderbolt arrow, the shield aegis, the spear of Voktor. Above in the high heavens, when Athena struck with full force for the first time, all gods were shaken. Outnumbered, Hera was at her wits' end. Poseidon, though wounded, still fought on without loss of spirit, and weaponless Ares was being driven back step by step. Yet Ares, the god presiding over unjust war, had his ferocity stirred. In his unique domain, the immense divine battle seemed to fuel his power, enhancing his fervor in combat. Of course, the gap in strength was clear, and the only acclaim Ares gained was from the other deities who now held him in higher regard, recognizing that the war god did have immense skills in the midst of a large-scale conflict. In any case, with a deft motion of her spear, the goddess of wisdom clad in battle gear, dominated the three gods from her superior position. The power of a true god at its limit is so terrifying that it astounds onlookers, including a deity who had, at long last, awakened from a deep slumber. Indeed, such mighty youths, even in later eras deities can emerge with such presence. Truly, like waves, the momentum of the predecessors will eventually wane, shattered against the shore, against the rocks. And if one wishes to avoid this fate, the only way is to withdraw early. Beneath the battleground of the divine war, a profound voice echoed among the seabed. Perhaps a side effect of a long slumber, the voice was clearly hoarse at first. But the speaker quickly recovered, clear and fluent by the time he finished speaking. To withdraw, yet you have already been drawn in, Pontus. The cause of the battle is your daughter, and your other children have joined as well. How can you possibly extract yourself from such strife? In the shadows, or to say, the depths of the trench were always filled with darkness. The voice of Erebus emerged quietly from within, narrating the current situation. He wasn't supposed to come at this time. But it must be said, the display of the Lord of Hell's power from Quito had truly taken Erebus by surprise. For a moment, Zeus was lured away, and part of the Lord of Darkness's domain lay just across the entrance to the underworld. He could time Zeus' comings and goings, and with the broad cover of the god's war masking many events, he was quick to change his plans and seek out the traces of the primordial sea god. It was not difficult to find Pontus. As one of the earliest deities, their bond with all things was so profound. If the Mariana Trench of later ages was the world's deepest ocean, then beneath the Sea of Chaos, under the Pontus Euxinus, was. Coming here, Erebus easily awakened Pontus with his power. To complete his plan, persuading the other was crucial. However, faced with the words of the Lord of Darkness, the primordial sea god seemed nonchalant. Prince Erebus, I appreciate that you took the time to chat with me. But if you're trying to urge me to emerge, then it's wholly unnecessary. You see, the underworld deities born of your power have never been of concern to you, and while my relationship to Nerus and others is closer, I wouldn't dare to rashly enter the world on their behalf. Besides, although we haven't had much interaction, I do understand Zeus. He isn't a person like my brother who's driven by brutishness. To him, interests matter more than whims. The Heavenly Father could forsake benefits over mere dislike, or torment his own child out of affection, even if it serves him no benefit. But Zeus isn't like that. Furthermore, having awakened this time as one of the earliest ancient gods, the connection with the world allowed me to see clearer. The net of order that covers the present, and the new symbols rising between heaven and earth. It's the sovereign, isn't it? Without a word, Erebus knew he couldn't easily convince Pontus. Yes, Zeus, who possessed sovereign, was destined to seek power, not punishment. If Atlas, the bearer of the heavens, chose to bow before him and become part of the order under sovereign, Zeus would probably set aside grievances and even personally welcome him. Experience more content on novel.com. Thus, no matter what, the offspring of the lineage of the primordial sea god wouldn't face too severe a consequence. It was simply a matter of allegiance to someone new. For Pontus, who is the master of the world, and who leads the gods of the primordial sea god lineage, does that matter? Of course not. He had decided to slumber, which meant he had let go of everything from his former life. Power, strength, and even all possessions. To use an apt metaphor, if the people are not afraid of death, how can death be used to threaten them? I have already renounced everything, so what significance do these discussions hold for me? Chapter 639 to 215, The Deal. Emotions drove actions, without any superfluous communication. Zeus stretched out his hand and gripped, then in the void, a ghostly long spear slowly solidified and was held in his hand. The aura emanating from the body of the spear was strong and ancient, but it was not a true divine artifact. Of course, for deities who had reached this stage, ordinary divine artifacts were of little use anyway. Just as Laine often used the power of death from the well of reincarnation to transform into a black sword. The long spear in Zeus's hand was also an embodiment of Asgard's power, one of the symbols of his sovereign. He opened up the divine domain, allowing all gods to build divine kingdoms, which in itself was a behavior that aligned with a sovereign's gathering of the masses. Hence, the Asgard divine domain was subtly changed to align more with the sovereign's authority. Perhaps a million years later, just like the scepter forged by the second-generation divine king, if there really was a next generation of divine king, Asgard might also be one of the things passed down to the successor. But all that was a matter for later. Holding the long spear, Zeus locked onto his opponent. Just like the shape of the long spear, which was the weapon of Asgard's previous master, the divine lance called Gingnir, which guaranteed hits. This imitation bestowed upon it certain characteristics that made its attacks difficult to evade. Whoosh! The long spear cleaved through the air, piercing the void. As a manifestation of divine domain power, it was like a world pressing down at the speed of light. If it had been in the outside world, such a strike would have made the earth sink and the stars tremble. However, this was the abyss, and Tartarus had enough power to contain such destruction brought by outsiders to its environment. Therefore, the supreme power was confined around the spear as it followed a mysterious trajectory towards the Lord of the Nine Hells. Naturally, what met the body of the spear was that blood-stained sickle. Clang! A crisp ringing sound as the blade collided with the spear. The next moment, vast power burst forth from their point of contact, tearing and reconstituting the laws of the void. However, it was quite evident that Zeus seemed to be at a disadvantage. His conjured spear directly shattered at the tip, although it reformed in the next moment, the outcome was still clear. How is this possible? No, it's the abyss. He was stunned for a moment, then Zeus suddenly realized. In theory, although he did not know the specifics of the opponent's strength, there should not be a huge gap between them according to the sensation from the divine authority. But the reality at hand made him realize that although the abyss also repelled hell, at his own doorstep, Asmodeus's power was still more fully exerted, unlike Zeus's. He was a true outsider, and also the one Tartarus sought to repel. Even so, feeling the difference in power, Zeus found it hard to accept. In such a place, was there actually another being capable of contending with him? Before his ascension, he had plenty of powerful enemies. After his ascension, there were still plenty. If it continued like this, wasn't his ascension in vain? You think geographical advantage can stop me? Dream on. Bang! Unwilling to retreat, but under the abyss's suppression, he truly was at a loss against the opponent before him. Then the next moment, with a roar, Zeus's figure burst open, then expanded 1,000 times over. He glared at Asmodeus ahead, his hands raised high towards the sky. As if shouldering the celestial sphere, the titanic deity declared war on the laws of the abyss. Come! The suppression of the abyss was too strong, and he could not exert his power at all, so what to do? Then, for the time being, he would borrow power from another world to fight it. Thus the power of Asgard flowed forth, converging between the raised hands of Zeus. The world's shadow emerged there, and as the image appeared, not only was another strike from the Lord of the Nine Hells blocked, but the suppression of the abyss was also briefly weakened. The price, though, was Asgard's power visibly draining away. I don't care, tools only have value when they are used. Taking a big step forward, Zeus recalled the unforgettable figure from the time of the epical transition. His vast form became even more immense, and without the barrier of interface power, the full symbol of his sovereignty was revealed for the first time in this world. Come, now let's see, who is the victor? Clenching his fists into a hammer, he struck down fiercely. And standing opposite Zeus, the lord of the 9 hells stood as immovable as a mountain. Drinking poison to quench thirst, how much longer can you hold on? Well then, I'll indulge you. Let's see how much of your reserves you can deplete before you calm down, Asmodeus said while facing off against Zeus for a long time and having learned to be precise and calculating when dealing with discrepancies in scale. So at this moment, watching Zeus, who was liberal with his resources, he felt a touch of nostalgia but did not hesitate to take advantage. Power in itself doesn't vanish. If not used now, it would be employed in the future. To drain some of it early was naturally a good thing. In the abyss, battle erupted, and upon the sea, a column of light pierced the sky, heralding the unsurprising outbreak of war among the gods. At the onset of the conflict, Keto sought Aphrodite without hesitation. There was no hatred between them, only the clash of interests brought about by power. Yet for deities, this was a far more intolerable dispute than any other. Elsewhere, Phoebe, the goddess of luminous, finally joined the battle, cloaking herself in a righteous cause. She believed that Artemis, as the daughter of the divine king, her own granddaughter, shouldn't be left to wander in the wild. She claimed that the other should travel to the stars to meet her grandfather. However, Artemis only responded to Phoebe's proposals with her bow and arrows. In terms of divine power, although the sun, moon, and stars no longer obeyed commands 3 eras later, the goddess of luminous had benefited from the expansion of the world, attaining a divine power level close to 18. By contrast, as a new goddess, even with the existence of the power of faith, Artemis was at a disadvantage in divine strength. However, the role of divine artifacts was evident in the clashes of true gods, and Artemis had not only acquired the new moon crown but also transformed another gift from Keto into a divine artifact in her hands. It was nothing else but the powers related to sea monsters and wildness that Keto, once the mother of sea monsters, had shed from her old form. Such power was of little significance to the reborn Keto, but it was perfectly aligned with Artemis as the master of the wilderness. Combined, they stood off against Phoebe as in the divine battles of the previous era, with no victor likely to emerge in short order. The other deities each had their own battlefields, with frequent clashes above the sea of Pontus Euxinus. And, without a doubt, the true focal point for the spectating gods was the fight at the center. The trident, thunderbolt arrow, the shield aegis, the spear of Voctor. Above in the high heavens, when Athena struck with full force for the first time, all gods were shaken. Outnumbered, Hera was at her wits' end. Poseidon, though wounded, still fought on without loss of spirit, and weaponless Ares was being driven back step by step. Yet Ares, the god presiding over unjust war, had his ferocity stirred. In his unique domain, the immense divine battle seemed to fuel his power, enhancing his fervor in combat. Of course, the gap in strength was clear, and the only acclaim Ares gained was from the other deities who now held him in higher regard, recognizing that the war god did have immense skills in the midst of a large-scale conflict. In any case, with a deft motion of her spear, the goddess of wisdom clad in battle gear, dominated the 3 gods from her superior position. The power of a true god at its limit is so terrifying that it astounds onlookers, including a deity who had, at long last, awakened from a deep slumber. Indeed, such mighty youths, even in later eras deities can emerge with such presence. Truly, like waves, the momentum of the predecessors will eventually wane, shattered against the shore, against the rocks. And if one wishes to avoid this fate, the only way is to withdraw early. Beneath the battleground of the divine war, a profound voice echoed among the seabed. Perhaps a side effect of a long slumber. The voice was clearly hoarse at first, but the speaker quickly recovered, clear and fluent by the time he finished speaking. To withdraw, yet you have already been drawn in, Pontus. The cause of the battle is your daughter, and your other children have joined as well. How can you possibly extract yourself from such strife? In the shadows, or to say, the depths of the trench were always filled with darkness. The voice of Erebus emerged quietly from within, narrating the current situation. He wasn't supposed to come at this time, but it must be said, the display of the Lord of Hell's power from Keto had truly taken Erebus by surprise. For a moment, Zeus was lured away, and part of the Lord of Darkness's domain lay just across the entrance to the underworld. He could time Zeus' comings and goings, and with the broad cover of the gods' war masking many events, he was quick to change his plans and seek out the traces of the primordial sea god. It was not difficult to find Pontus. As one of the earliest deities, their bond with all things was so profound. If the Mariana Trench of later ages was the world's deepest ocean, then beneath the Sea of Chaos, under the Pontus Euxinus, was. Coming here, Erebus easily awakened Pontus with his power. To complete his plan, persuading the other was crucial. However, faced with the words of the Lord of Darkness, the primordial sea god seemed nonchalant. Prince Erebus, I appreciate that you took the time to chat with me, but if you're trying to urge me to emerge, then it's wholly unnecessary. You see, the underworld deities born of your power have never been of concern to you, and while my relationship to Nerus and others is closer, I wouldn't dare to rashly enter the world on their behalf. Besides, although we haven't had much interaction, I do understand Zeus. He isn't a person like my brother who's driven by brutishness. To him, interests matter more than whims. The Heavenly Father could forsake benefits over mere dislike, or torment his own child out of affection, even if it serves him no benefit. But Zeus isn't like that. Furthermore, having awakened this time as one of the earliest ancient gods, the connection with the world allowed me to see clearer. The net of order that covers the present, and the new symbols rising between heaven and earth. It's the sovereign, isn't it? Without a word, Erebus knew he couldn't easily convince Pontus. Yes, Zeus, who possessed sovereign, was destined to seek power, not punishment. If Atlas, the bearer of the heavens, chose to bow before him and become part of the order under sovereign, Zeus would probably set aside grievances and even personally welcome him. Experience more content on novel.com. Thus, no matter what, the offspring of the lineage of the primordial sea god wouldn't face too severe a consequence. It was simply a matter of allegiance to someone new. For Pontus, who is the master of the world, and who leads the gods of the primordial sea god lineage, does that matter? Of course not. He had decided to slumber, which meant he had let go of everything from his former life. Power, strength, and even all possessions. To use an apt metaphor, if the people are not afraid of death, how can death be used to threaten them? I have already renounced everything, so what significance do these discussions hold for me? Chapter 640 to 216, The Sky, Ocean, and Land. Oh, you seem to see things quite clearly. Zeus is indeed such a person. He won't mind you staying in the depths of the ocean, nor will he care that you once opposed him. After all, you pose no actual threat to him. As long as you are willing to submit, all can be turned over. Erebus nodded slightly, expressing his agreement with Pontus's statement. However, in the unfathomable ocean trench, the spirit of the primordial sea god tensed up. If it were so simple to make the other side give up, that would be perfect. But no matter how he thought about it, he did not believe things would be that simple. Yes, Lord Erebus, I no longer intend to be an enemy to anyone. And it's not just me, Araya, who has transformed into Mount Olympus, feels the same. This world is no longer our era. Even the Titans have withdrawn from the stage, let alone us. The world has welcomed its new masters, so let the past grievances dissipate with the wind. The voice echoed at the bottom of the sea, growing weaker and weaker. Pontus decided to enter a deeper slumber directly. He was no match for Erebus, but his adversary could not force him to do anything either. As one of the original deities, Pontus's understanding of these primordial deities far exceeded that of later gods. He knew clearly that although for most people, the degree of personification of a primordial god seemed to only affect the strength of their power, in reality, aside from the fully personified Gaia, both Erebus and Nyx could not walk about for long. They spent most of their time isolated from the world, voluntarily in Nyx's case, but for Erebus, it was partly voluntary and partly forced. Only a truly complete great divine power can unite with the source power, exist symbolically without eroding its persona, maintaining its thoughts and human nature intact, but this is something no one in current times can truly achieve. So, Pontus was worried but still confident because he knew that even in the worst-case scenario, it would only result in the Lord of Darkness lashing out and leaving after venting for a while. The threat he posed was limited. His fundamentally nonviolent nature believed that due to various factors, the other party couldn't exert absolute violence and thus could not pose a real threat to him. Is that so? Pontus's refusal was so direct that he even began to close off his senses. However, faced with such a reaction, Erebus just smiled and nodded again in approval. Perhaps you're right, Pontus. This is no longer your era. But just because it isn't yours doesn't mean it isn't someone else's. At least I feel that the age of the first era is far from over. Of course, since you're unwilling. Let's leave it at that. I won't force you, make whatever choice you want. The voice was even somewhat cheerful as the Lord of Darkness's robe fluttered slightly. He showed no annoyance at being rejected but simply waved his hand and continued walking forward. The bottom of this ocean was so calm and lightless, surrounded by seabeds. And the place he was heading to was the only destination, that profound sea trench itself. What are you? Wait, Lord Erebus, what are you doing? I refused you, so are you going to attack me? Find adventures at novel bin.com. Suddenly, the previously quiet voice rang out again. Pontus seemed a bit nervous, but Erebus just explained softly, indicating he had no ill intentions. Don't misunderstand, since you want to sleep, then sleep. Everything in the material realm has been forsaken by you, so what I do should be irrelevant to you. Rest assured, I won't disturb your slumber anymore, I just want to solve a long-standing puzzle. Taking a step, Erebus descended towards the seemingly bottomless ravine. Lights and shadows flickered behind him, indifferent to the natural wonders that had been early set around him. The Lord of Darkness continued forward, and at this moment, Pontus seemed to realize what the other was about to do. Wait, this is where I sleep. If you're not planning to disturb me, why intrude here? Okay, you just want me to do something for you, right? I'll hear you out, as long as it's not too much. Bang! Within the sea trench, invisible forces converged, seemingly intent on stopping Erebus's advance, but it all proved futile. Without pausing for even a moment, Pontus's barriers were shattered by Erebus. As if unaware, the Lord of Darkness continued downward. Stop, you've won. I don't want to be your enemy, just say what you want to do, but this isn't a place for you. Crack. Another deep blue light barrier was shattered, but interestingly, it seemed not to be a recent barrier. Perhaps it was thousands of years ago. Or perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, Pontus had already set up this obstacle. Watching this scene, the Lord of Darkness's smile grew even thicker. Indeed, I knew it. Haha, it looks like I'm in the right place. Stop, Erebus, what exactly are you doing? Do you know what you are doing? The furious shout of the primordial sea god echoed throughout the sea trench, but it was just a meaningless protest. Ignoring him, the next moment, an immense power slowly spread from Erebus's being. The entire sea trench was enveloped by it, everything was obscured by him. The gods in the sky had no idea what was happening beneath their feet, and Erebus's footsteps still did not stop. Chapter 641, 216, The Sky, Ocean, and Land _2. Chapter 641, Chapter 216, The Sky, Ocean, and Land _2. One ancient barrier after another was broken, compromises, curses, advisories, and threats emerged from the mouth of Pontus. The voice of Pontus changed several times in a brief period until he gradually realized that the Lord of Darkness probably would not stop his advance. Then he fell silent. In the soundless silence, it was unknown how deep he had descended. Finally, at a certain moment, in front of a terrifying barrier interwoven with yellow and blue, Erebus finally halted. The magnificent and substantial barrier in front of him was different from the previous ones, which were enough to stop the strength of most true gods, meaningless to Erebus. But within this barrier, there likewise existed a power beyond that of the true gods. With just one glance, Erebus easily identified the source of the barrier's power. Some of its strength perhaps came from Pontus, but the most crucial part belonged to Gaia. And it was not the current her but rather her from long ago. Indeed, so it is. After the end of the first epoch, Gaia left Mount Ophres, went to the shores of the Eastern Sea, and lived with you for a long time. Haha, I knew it, she wasn't as mad back then. Having ended her brutal husband, even if her children weren't so obedient, how could she have left her residence of millions of years so cleanly and directly come to your side? Even finding the leisure to have children with you? Because she wanted to leave this seal, keeping everyone in the dark about it. She even refused to tell Cronus, because he, too, was a divine king. Laughing out loud, although he was quite confident before, now he finally received confirmation. Rumor has it that after Heavenly Father and Mother Earth, Gaia bore with her second son Pontus the 5 gods of the Great Sea. Therefore, theoretically, Keto and Nerus are actually also Gaia's children. But why, compared to the Titans or even the giants, did the obsessive Mother Earth seem to have never cared about these sea gods? Contrasting her previous character, this seemed completely illogical. Now, everything was answered. It wasn't that Gaia discriminated against the sea gods, it was because the 5 offspring of the primordial sea god were just like the gods of the underworld. They were the children born from the union of the earth and the sea represented by Pontus, under the guidance of some power. They were actually not recognized by Gaia as her children, and thus she never cared about them. So the question arose, what could the power that influenced Gaia to give birth to true gods, that made the then Mother Earth value and fear it so much that she even personally concealed her tracks to perform the sealing, possibly be? As you see, Prince Erebus, this is the root of all evils. The profound voice echoed under the ocean. Pontus was no longer silent. By this stage, everything was clear. Since he could not hide it anymore, he explained. Cronus used the sickle to end the patriarchy of Uranus. Oceanus threw it into the sea to prevent it from being taken back by Heavenly Father. And I too betrayed that tyrant. I hid it, buried in the deepest part of the ocean. It's the scene you all have witnessed once. The power of Heavenly Father is so immense, his spilled blood could turn into the ash tree goddess, his spilled essence could give birth to the goddess of beauty and vengeance. The former Uranus with the authority of the first-generation divine king ruled all living beings, sublimating the sky and patriarchy, owning power that even you had to acknowledge back then. Until today, nearly 2 epochs have passed, with time perfecting, gods being born, life proliferating, the sky and patriarchy have already taken that critical step like the complete ocean and water, congealing their symbols. It's just that like the ocean which has never united, so the symbols of ocean and water are qualified to solidify but have never actually formed. And thus Uranus remains in eternal slumber, hence the sky and patriarchy have not made that leap and have not impacted the world today. Even because of their simultaneous empowerment, he has no signs of awakening to this day. As long as this seal remains intact, he will not awaken. So you will not open it, right? Dark currents surged under the sea. Half an epoch later, with the convergence of the currents, Pontus once again manifested in his personified form in the world. However, the towering deity was only filled with trepidation. He knew he could not stop the other party, but he still tried to persuade. No one knows how terrible it would be if Uranus were to retake it, and remember, he was once the divine king. Erebus, no matter what you plan to scheme, do you really think a being like him would act according to your plan? Of course, he wouldn't, Pontus. I know, Uranus, he'll just scoff at me like that madman Typhon. No, he's not that mad. At least the former him still knew to fear the power of fate. Smiling lightly, to the Lord of Darkness, the barrier in front was not hard to break, especially after the lengthy ages, particularly the Great War at the end of the Second Epoch. Even though the war did not reach here, the seal was weakened by the injuries to the earth and the sea. Meanwhile, as more deities came into being and the world grew more complete, as patriarchy was naturally lifted due to the birth of deities. Chapter 642, 216, The Sky, Ocean, and Land _3. Chapter 642, Chapter 216, The Sky, Ocean, and Land _3. With just a gentle effort, the seal would have turned to nothing. But consequent to that, Gaia would have sensed it. Fortunately, I was prepared, he said. Earth Mother Gaia's barrier could be sensed upon touch, even if it was submerged in deep slumber. Yet, long ago, another barrier, almost similar, had proved to be in vain. It was the barrier that protected the golden apple tree, and what rendered it useless was something called the life vase. Losing something and not even updating the protection, hey. She probably forgot about this place long ago. There was some sarcasm. Time would erode everything, including the past fear of Uranus, but Gaia's mistakes were something Erebus delighted in seeing. So, he extended his hand forward, a greenish light swirling around his wrist. In Pontus's eyes filled with panic, Erebus didn't hesitate to reach beyond the barrier. The next moment, a warm glowing orb, as if held by the Lord of Darkness himself, and at the same time, if not for the domain of darkness that enveloped the place. Erebus might have felt the orb soaring beyond the 9th heaven, returning to its master's embrace. Erebus, you still went ahead and did it. Word by word, Pontus was unable to understand such an action. What good did this do him? However, Erebus did not intend to let him understand. He simply gazed at the orb in his hand and asked indifferently. Pontus, who do you think Uranus hates most? Perhaps Cronus, but he has been traceless for a long time. Yes, that's right. Erebus chuckled softly and then asked. And the second most hated? Probably the Earth Mother, but more likely the Spirit Master, Pontus said hesitantly. To him, both his wife's betrayal and the despicable prophet could be the second. Yet, the former had endured the tyrannical oppression of Heavenly Father, making her betrayal somewhat understandable. Therefore, while Uranus wouldn't forgive Gaia, he would likely place her third. And the fourth most hated? He asked again, and this time, Erebus directly gave the answer. The fourth most hated are you and Oceanus. One cast his body into the ocean, the other hid it. Neither of you can escape. So what do you mean? What are you here to do? His inner worries pinpointed, Pontus tensely clenched his fist. If only you had not meddled, nothing would have happened. But Erebus simply shook his head and continued. Cronus, now nowhere to be found, Laine and Gaia, even if he awakens, it won't be easy to resolve. But you and Oceanus, you aren't great, so although you rank fourth and fifth, in reality, you're the first ones to suffer. And unlike me, Uranus, he will linger long beneath the sky. Just listen, hear out my plan. Or do you intend to count on Zeus to protect you? Only you can protect yourself. And I am here for that very reason. Everything under control. Erebus swept his sleeve, tucking the orb within. However, just as he intended to continue his conversation with Pontus, a subtle disturbance from beneath the earth immediately caught his attention. The underworld was trembling. The ash was rising and falling, and even though separated by a dense layer, Erebus seemed to still hear the thunderous roar. And following it, a writhing, tortuous demonic spirit with no end in sight. Chapter 643, Chapter 217, Foolproof. Underworld, Fields of Truth. When both the surface and the abyss were engaged in fierce combat, the underworld, bathed in moonlight, remained remarkably tranquil. There was still a slight delay before the noise from the abyss could be heard. At this moment, in the Fields of Truth, one could see a continuous stretch of buildings rising and falling, and silent creatures coming and going. Everything appeared orderly, much like a grand silent film. And in the central Hades palace, Hades was holding a goblet, drinking by himself. The queen of the underworld had gone to the surface to gather information, and no other gods from the underworld had been summoned. In front of him, to his side, sat only Charon, the ferryman of the River of Sorrow, stiff and upright, with a respectful expression on his aged face. Your Majesty truly has a masterful strategy, knowing early on that those fellows were unreliable. Without your command, Eris dared to serve the divine king behind your back. This is our inborn difference. Here in the underworld, it is only I, Charon, who exists because of your birth. The voice seemed to come from the depths of the soul, earnest in every word. Charon appeared to be genuinely accusing the other underworld deities of betrayal, voicing grievances on behalf of Hades. However, his words were not without reason. Previously, the underworld deities were born from the power of the primordial gods, naturally favoring them slightly more. Moreover, given the absolute gap in strength, it was not surprising they would choose to betray at such a time. Of course, strictly speaking, this could not really be considered betrayal. Just as Hades himself was also one of the principal gods of Olympus, it was hard for others to criticize the deities for not serving under Zeus's command. One wonders if Hera knew that the golden apple came from Zeus's instructions? Probably not. With a calm expression, Hades thought maliciously. Well, let's not talk about that anymore. Everyone has their own aspirations, so today, it's only you here, isn't it? Having finished his pomegranate wine, Hades set down his goblet and waved slightly. The gods of this world often forget his existence, but he certainly does not forget theirs. Regardless, at least Queen Persephone spends half of each year on Mount of the Gods. Even if he does not pay close attention, many mortal affairs cannot be hidden from him. Of course, the matter of the golden apple was not known through such means. As the lord of the underworld, Hades might not have reached the great divine power, but his perception in certain areas still surpassed that of other deities. such as the abnormal fluctuations of the world power, for example. So although Hades, like Zeus, did not know why these fluctuations occurred, or even failed to determine that this was the world power tilting externally, he could still sense that some unknown changes were happening in this world. Hence, the subsequent actions were only natural. Being more vigilant, Hades wasn't blind. The Golden Apple incident was entirely Zeus's plot, with Erebus simply making sure the underworld deities served him. Without the authority of the Lord of Darkness to cover them, possessing great power in the underworld, and wearing the helmet of invisibility, Hades easily investigated the anomalies among the underworld deities. But clear as it was, there wasn't a law in the underworld that prohibited deities from serving the divine king. Therefore, in this situation, Hades couldn't directly do much for the moment. However, since they had first been unkind, he had no choice but to be unjust in return. If they did not recognize their allegiance to the king of the underworld, then they should not expect to share in the underworld's benefits. Charon, how are the preparations going? Setting aside his troubles, Hades asked faintly. He had been preparing for this for quite a while. Hearing this question, Charon, who had been waiting, a hint of joy flashing in his eyes, responded as calmly as possible. Your Majesty, after years of accumulation, the power of the river of sorrow is now sufficient. After all, I have no other place to use it. Nowadays, as souls flow into the underworld through the river of oblivion, Acheron's existence is virtually redundant. Your Majesty, just give the order, and I will expand your territory for you. Hey, it's hardly about expanding territory. It's already part of the underworld, we're just there to claim it. Pleased, Hades nodded, his mood visibly lightened. In the rivers of the underworld, apart from Phlegethon, which he himself had created, there were only 3 rivers innately formed. The river Styx of oaths and hatred, Cocytus Lethe of oblivion and lamentation, and Acheron of sorrow and the unyielding. The first 2, one flowing into the abyss, connecting to the outside world. Wielding the power of oaths, were the most well-known underworld rivers, the other bearing the souls of the dead deep into the spirit realm, stripping them of their life memories, leaving only their laments and memories of old. But only Acheron seemed to have lost its purpose. As a river born alongside Hades, the river of sorrow was, like the other 2 great rivers of the underworld, vested with some authority of the underworld. However, perhaps originally in the mythology, since the destination of souls was still the underworld, Charon as the ferryman could still stand at the gates of the underworld, demanding a toll from anyone who wished to cross. But now, no one needed him to ferry them across. Mortals couldn't come, and deities didn't need to. So, although it was also a naturally occurring underworld river, Acheron's power was extraordinarily weak, and no matter who looked, there seemed to be no direction for growth. Chapter 644, Chapter 217, Foolproof_2. After all, he couldn't possibly go above ground in the guise of a river god and attempt to unify the many rivers. Not to mention whether the divine king would object or how the Lord of Ocean would react. Styx alone was an insurmountable threshold for him. So for a considerable amount of time, Charon was just an idler in the underworld. Hades initially thought so as well, even for himself who was short of help. Charon really didn't have much of a presence. This situation continued until the Typhon disaster, when the Wraith Evans reported to him a discovery, marking the first time the River of Sorrow had actual significance. C3 to 168. After personally making a significant effort to seal the Silence Crown, Hades, who finally located the entrance to the land of the dead, Helheim, encountered trouble once again. In this alien realm, filled with the aura of death, he faced rejection once again. Different from Asgard or any remnant of the 9 realms. That world rejected living things, it was determined by its inherent law. Unfortunately, as a god of chaos, Hades inherently lacked the possibility of death like the deities of the 9 realms. However, for Hades, encountering trouble was nothing out of the ordinary, as his divine life had always been about overcoming endless problems, never having stumbled upon fortunate windfalls like Zeus. Therefore, after just a bit of thought, Hades came up with a solution. If the environment rejected him, then he must either change himself or the environment. As the Lord of the Underworld, Hades lacked the ability to change himself, and even if he could, he wouldn't turn himself into a deceased. Thus, changing the environment remained the only solution. For this purpose, he summoned Charon, deciding to use this useless Styx river to achieve his goal. 3 rivers of the underworld, one flowing into the abyss, one into the spirit realm, and this third one, into the land of the dead. Since he couldn't collect a fairy fee at the gates of the underworld, then he would collect it at Helheim's gates. As the river with some authority over the underworld laws, allowing Acheron to burst into Helheim also meant the laws of the underworld were eroding and assimilating that realm. Strong though Helheim was, without the world tree, if it claimed to match the entire underworld, that would be an impossibility. With the gap in strength, the outcome of the erosion was certain. And once this assimilation led by himself truly completed, Hades himself didn't know what kind of benefits he would reap. Before Poseidon, the sea had its master; before Zeus, the mortal realm had 3 generations of divine kings, but only the underworld had a single ruler from beginning to end. He is the Uranus of the underworld, the original lord of the dead, the embodiment of the underworld land, and the one who contributed the most. So for him, strengthening the underworld meant strengthening himself. Let the Styx River pave the way, and later he would select capable wraiths and demigods from the mortal realm to enter, accelerating the occupation of Helheim. And when that time comes, boom, his expression changing slightly, Hades abruptly rose from his throne. Just now, a massive tremor suddenly came from afar, causing the underworld to shake, even the palace swayed. And that direction, could it be the abyss? Charon, did someone enter the underworld just now? Catching the essence instantly, Hades asked seriously. Hearing this, Charon extended his senses, exchanging perception with the Acheron River. Your Majesty, there has been. A short while ago, the king of all gods just entered the underworld, said Charon. I knew it; whenever he's involved, nothing good ever happens. Cursing under his breath, Hades never imagined that he'd stop minding his own golden apples, and still, Zeus would find a way to trouble him. But just as he thought this, another even larger tremor occurred, and Hades couldn't help but let out a light huff. However, it's fortunate, I already made preparations for this. The earth quaked, shockwaves continued, the previous tremors were clearly not isolated. But Hades merely stepped forward leisurely, reaching out to knock on a pillar inside the palace. The crisp sound echoed through the great hall, and while an ordinary person might not understand its significance, Charon's eyes widened upon hearing the disturbance. Heh, it seems you've caught on? Indeed, few are aware that, as the god of the underworld, I also control a considerable portion of the mineral wealth beneath the earth. What other deities consider precious materials are merely commonplace to me. So, Charon, I've learned from previous lessons, and as I constructed this palace of Hades, I made ample preparations. Before, Hades said, clenching his fist, articulating every word, do you know how many times this palace has been destroyed? 3 times. And each time, they were unwarranted disasters. But that is in the past. From now on, it will never collapse again, because this palace has been cast using the method of forging divine artifacts. Sans the authority and might. Materially speaking, this is a massively scaled-up divine artifact. HMPH, with this, unless a great divine power directly targets my palace, mere shockwaves will no longer harm it. Let Zeus himself strike at it, and it would be best. Hades didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear: it would be best if Zeus broke a few legs. As for being killed, that was naturally impossible. Hades didn't entertain such fantasies. Your Majesty is truly formidable, with far-sighted wisdom and marvelous stratagems. This time, it is surely foolproof. Praise came from beside him, as Charon, who had decided to align closely with a powerful ally, did not hesitate to flatter unabashedly. If one overlooked the great disparities in their appearances, he even bore a slight resemblance to Zephyrus. Cough, let's not celebrate in haste, wait for matters to conclude. Hades coughed lightly, feeling like he had been slightly too emotional. But this was a normal reaction. Anybody's home being destroyed repeatedly would respond in kind. Since there's an issue, you needn't rush to leave. I want to see what sort of enemy Zeus has provoked in the abyss. Boom. The door at the junction of the abyss and the underworld shook with an increasingly violent rumble. Inside Tartarus, Zeus was slowly retreating. Though initially overwhelmed with rage, Zeus eventually remained Zeus. For someone like him, unless cornered, engaging in a battle to the death without considering pros and cons was utterly out of the question. So as he calmed down, Zeus began to move towards the gates of the abyss. As the king of all gods, He had begun to realize during the fight that the abyss was repelling not only him but also the opponent, albeit to a lesser degree. The closer he got to the portal, the less pressure he felt upon himself, and the greater the pressure became on his adversary. In such a scenario, there was no need to say how he would act. Defeat was not an option, nor was flight. As the king of all gods, even for the stability of his sovereignty, he could not afford to lose to an unknown foe. Just battled for 300 rounds and emerged with a slight edge, but due to the conflicting interests of the gods over the ocean, had to retreat temporarily. With the script silently planned, Zeus's grip never loosened. However, amidst the heat of battle, Zeus failed to notice a colossal entity, nearly fused with the chaotically profound void of the abyss, was stealthily approaching him. Chapter 645, Chapter 218, Heaven's Fall. Whirring, Zeus, can you only run? Your level as a divine king seems just so-so. The chaotic void stirred like a flowing stream under the disruption of power. Near the entrance to the abyss, Asmodeus watched Zeus, who stood with his back against the portal. It must be said that compared to 1,000 years ago, Zeus had indeed grown much stronger. Perhaps the fruit of one day played a role, but regardless, the strength was palpably real. Run? An existence like you, if you dared to step into the present world, I could suppress you with a flip of my hand. Lord of Hell, you are merely a creature that hides its head but shows its tail. From within the abyss, outside the myriad abyss planes in the void, Zeus responded with a cold laugh. His colossal true body surrounded by lightning, the huge celestial sphere slowly rotating above his head. Big talk was easy to make, although the opponent's power was great, it was far from overwhelming him. The reason Zeus had retreated here was merely to choose an environment more advantageous to him. At the portal that connected the two realms, the interface's suppression was reduced by more than a notch. In the recent battle, apart from a slight misstep at the beginning, Zeus, quickly regaining his composure, soon turned part of the disadvantage around. After all, strictly speaking, what he said was not entirely false. The abyss was not his home court, and though it seemed not to be the opponent's either. Since Zeus could fight evenly with this being who claimed to be the Lord of Hell here, it meant that if the battlefield were the mortal realm, the opponent would definitely not be his match. With his biggest concern alleviated, Zeus felt a mix of relief and gratitude for his own prudence and caution. Indeed, his strategy of probing little by little was correct. If there had been no golden apple as a buffer, and he had directly shown his hand in intimidating all gods, who knows how many more obstructors would have jumped out. Now things were much better. He could completely follow the plan, gradually use the expanding conflict to consolidate his authority, enhance his strength, and meanwhile clarify who was his enemy and who could be enlisted as his ally. This was just the beginning. He needed to find a way to further probe the opponent's foundation and see if there were any subjects that could be rallied. Like now, since this being residing in Tartarus yet shunned by the abyss showed him hostility, it suggested that perhaps the native life here might be persuaded to his side. It was hard to judge, but there was still a chance. Because some instinct told Zeus that he seemingly should have some connection here, just like the inexplicable affinity he felt towards the abyss before he became the divine king. Looking at it now, that was probably not a delusion. Counter-suppress? Then try experiencing it first. Despite pondering in his mind, the clash between the two had not ceased. Accompanied by the echoes deep within the abyss, a dark gleaming halo swept over from afar. And deep malevolent thoughts converged on Zeus from all directions. Looking around, threats were everywhere, the only gap was right behind Zeus. But could he possibly retreat? Of course not, and there was no need. The opponent couldn't cope with him, but Zeus wasn't necessarily the same. If he were to leave, it would be after defeating the opponent with one move, and the opportunity was right in front of him. Clang. Ha. Indeed, you really don't understand the strength of the divine king if you dared chase me here. Do you really think I am afraid of you? Come, witness my power. With the exit right behind him, Lord of the Nine Hells clearly aimed to drive Zeus out of the abyss in disgrace. However, at this moment, a divine light shone brightly in Zeus's eyes. The abyss repels the present world, just as chaos repels order, but in fact, there has always been one aspect that ordinary people overlook. The power of the divine king is ultimately somewhat special. The Titans could be imprisoned in the abyss by Uranus, even if it meant diminishing the Heavenly Father's sovereign power, but it was still accomplished. Perhaps because the divine king's power is granted by the present world, it often exhibits a divine anomaly that doesn't belong to its current layer. Therefore, Zeus had always known that if he was willing to pay some price, he could indeed summon stronger powers here. And at the entrance of the abyss, the price he had to pay was undoubtedly the minimal one. So, accompanied by laughter, the tricolor scepter of the divine king appeared in Zeus's hand. At this moment, his power surged tremendously. Strike with one punch to avoid 100. A king does not need the strength to defeat all people joined together. That is the foolish choice of a tyrant like Uranus. For true power, deterrence is the most cost-effective choice. Whether it's winning over potential allies or deterring that ancient god who had secretly meddled in the mortal realm since the Bronze Age, Zeus needed a genuine victory. Open! A fierce shout, and the celestial sphere fell, hurtling down towards the spreading darkness. The Lord of the Nine Hells hadn't expected Zeus to suddenly unleash such strength and involuntarily dodged backward. However, how could a mere spatial distance flatten the clash of great divine powers, unless it is condensed by a truly great one, symbolizing space-time authority? Otherwise such distance is basically null. Ha ha ha, what are you dodging? The laughter spread under the force of the divine king, echoing in the chaotic void, as Zeus intentionally drew more attention. Only by defeating his opponent in full view and then retreating could he achieve his goal. Who? As the battle turned, the situation was upended, and Zeus instantly gained the upper hand, ready to leave his enemy with an indelible lesson. However, in the next instant, Zeus's expression drastically changed, and Asmodeus, who had just retreated in an attempt to dodge, instead met his attack head-on without hesitation. In the originally deep and empty darkness, it seemed as if something suddenly surfaced. And Zeus suddenly realized that he had more than one enemy? Yes, the power on Keto and that humans seemed different, but he had thought that was just the difference in authority one person used. Who would have expected that the abyss, always thought to be a prison, could produce two beings capable of threatening him? Zeus, like I said, your tricks are too naive. Confronting directly, the massive falling celestial sphere caused the Lord of the Nine Hells' arms to creak audibly, but he charged head-on as if he didn't care. Zeus, you can't make it. Boom. At the boundary between the underworld and the abyss, a rumbling sound, growing deeper, continuously emanated, shaking the void intermittently. Mere collisions of substance were not enough to shake the world. This was a manifestation of a conflict of laws on the material plane. The continuous turbulence caused the entire underworld to sway from side to side as if it were a ship in a storm, pitching and heaving. Of course, no matter what, the underworld was a relatively intact realm, and wouldn't suffer any real damage. It only posed a great threat to the lives within the underworld. Fortunately, after the shaking persisted for a while, when a powerful force of Sove Regen flowed along the passageway into the abyss, this trembling was briefly halted. This was the power from the divine king, from the order of the current world, but it equally stabilized the space-time of the underworld. After all, although the underworld, much like the celestial sphere, had regions not covered by the laws of the current world, its main structure was still part of the order of chaos. Under the divine king's power, those previously unstable laws immediately returned to normal, as if the earlier shaking had been nothing but an illusion. The clamor of the world disappeared. The vast expanse of gray soil seemed suddenly to quiet down. Only the river of fire continued to roll, and the lowly wraiths lingering on the ground continued their aimless wandering. It seemed as though the disaster had ended, or perhaps it had only just begun. The entire world was as calm as the stillness before a storm. Thud, a dull sound once again came from the entrance to the abyss. The creatures atop the gray soil gazed blankly at the sky, but clearly, nothing would halt because of them. Thud, thud, thud. Following that, another three sounds came consecutively. The low sounds, each more dull yet more resonant than the last, seemed like some terrifying entity knocking from behind the doors of the abyss. But the gates of Tartarus were so sturdy that only after the third knock did this barrier, which isolated the outer chaos, finally collapse under the relentless assault of this tempest. An endless blaze of light emanated from the edge of the underworld, briefly covering even the nether moon. The next moment, a scorching sun seemed to shine upon the netherworld. Thud, boom, crack. In an instant, the celestial sphere was reversed. The eternal sky of the underworld was surrounded by thunder and lightning. and a huge humanoid figure fell out of the gates of the abyss. This true god that revealed itself was even more enormous than the Hecatonchera of old, yet inexplicably, its lower half was entirely missing. Hiss! Zeus, you can't do this. Clang! The titan fell from the gates, but a vast shadow followed just behind it. Time seemed to lose its meaning. 1 second before, the cataclysm had just begun, and the next, it seemed as though a wall as high as the heavens had risen on all sides of the underworld. At that moment, only a few deities with authority over the underworld could see this frightful change from a higher perspective. A great serpent impossibly coiled around the underworld thrice in a blink. Its body was still unending in the abyss, but its massive head was already positioned upon the titan. Hiss! Asmodeus was right, you indeed fall far short. Boom! The great sound was formless. In the eyes of the beings of the underworld, they could not see the serpent, they could only see that next to the nether moon. Two luminous bodies had unexpectedly appeared, and the sky suddenly fell. The titan seemed to want to resist, it vainly tried to support the sky with the last of its arms. But the old strength was exhausted and new strength had yet to arise. At least in that moment, it could only use a tenth or so of its power. Thus, like a mantis lifting its arms against a wheel or like a mayfly trying to shake the earth, its momentary resistance was futile. Under the pressure of the sky, the titan collapsed with a crash. And where it fell, Zeus, you're such a... Almost swearing, Hades flamboyantly waved his sleeve, using the brief moment when the titan and the sky were deadlocked to lift everyone in the fields of truth, then invoked the authority of the underworld to vanish from that place. At that moment, he didn't know whether to consider his luck good or bad. Because both of his previous prophecies had come true. Looking back after fleeing thousands of miles, Hades kept distancing himself while watching the location of the fields of truth. Unsurprisingly, he would have to rebuild. Next time I will definitely build a temple connected to the origin of the underworld, which even if all the great divine powers of the world were to come here, they wouldn't dare act recklessly to destroy. As much as he swore resolution, fleeing was still necessary. At that moment, Hades's only consolation was that Zeus's legs also seemed to have truly broken. Chapter 646, Chapter 219 Lies. On the ground of the underworld, Hades's figure was rapidly flickering. The sky seemed to tilt for a moment, stars fell to the mortal realm. And he was trying to move far from the impact's center point, and stabilize the underworld land as much as possible with his power. That is to say, the sky of the underworld is not the real sky, it doesn't need tools to prop it up. Otherwise, the destruction caused by Zeus's fall would not be limited to the fields of truth. Whoosh! The fallen star swept through the air, only holding stiff for a short while before the celestial body continued to sink. Black flames wrapped around the meteor, and the hellfire burned relentlessly on Zeus's body. That was one of the signs of hell, the flame brought from the divided Muspelheim by the 9 hells, and the darkness inherent in silver humanity, which together gave the flame a tendency, constituting the demon fire unique to hell. Of course, despite their impressive origins, this didn't mean that the flames could scorch Zeus. For Zeus, the flames burning on his body actually couldn't harm him. In fact, they could only prove that he was indeed too preoccupied to care. Rise! Pushing up with his hands, Zeus raised his head, his eyes flashing with thunderfire locked gazes with the colossal serpent in the sky. Only this great serpent, indeed, he had been tricked, but at least he had been partially successful. The Lord of the 9 hells, who had taken his direct hit, was definitely not feeling good. The fact that the other party was not pursuing their victory was proof. Now, if he could just block this terrible creature's one strike, then he still had a chance to turn the situation around. Yes, monster. In Zeus's eyes, the serpent of the central court was undoubtedly like the Titans and Typhon, beings that did not belong to the deity system, also demons not recognized by most gods. Rise, for me, rise. Giving his all, under Zeus's widened eyes, his falling speed seemed indeed not to be increasing as rapidly. When leaving the abyss and returning to the domain of the living realm, his strength grew at an extremely fast pace. If he had enough time, he could completely block this strike. However, the next moment, Zeus became desperately aware that he probably didn't have that much time, because although his falling speed had slowed down, the distance between the heavens and earth of the underworld was far smaller than that of the surface above. He couldn't wait to recover his full power, and the ground was already within reach. Even faintly, Zeus felt like his lower body was about to come into contact with something hard and sharp. That metallic sharpness so distinct. But this was probably an illusion, right? There were no enemies in the underworld, nor did he sense the presence of other deities below him. Ruling out the possibility that someone was preparing to backstab him with a weapon from beneath, it couldn't be that the geology of the underworld had changed, huh? In his unstoppable descent, Zeus's face changed abruptly. Pain transmitted from below as flesh and metal collided. Since when had the ground and palace of the underworld become so hard? SSST. In an instant, blood splattered. Zeus, who was doing his utmost to battle the great serpent, had never anticipated another backstab from below. The sharp edges of Hades' palace were like blades, stabbing viciously into him under the force of his own fall. His face contorted in an instant. If this were a normal time, these buildings, although solid, wouldn't be able to affect Zeus's divine body. If he had even the slightest reserve of power left, an instinctive defense wouldn't have allowed him to be injured so easily. And even if the owner of these palaces wasn't the Lord of Underworld, and Hades hadn't gathered strength to stabilize the land of the Underworld, their most probable fate would have been to be blown further down by the impact, buried under dust in the ruins. But reality knows no ifs, and the Divine King wouldn't dare allow Zeus to crash unrestrained into the bottom layer of the Underworld. So standing in the distance, watching the trajectory of Zeus's fall, Hades hesitated only for a moment before continuing to maintain the tenacity of the strata. Well, Zeus was just having a hard time, especially since he came to the Underworld unannounced. Anyhow, this was much better than the Underworld land suffering damage and him suffering from the backlash. Consequently, when the land was reinforced by the entire strength of the Underworld, the previously continuous buildings became like ore caught between an iron blanket and hammer, bound to either melt away or shatter the forces smashing against it. And the outcome of this time, naturally, was that all three bore varying degrees of damage. Boom! The world stood still for a moment, followed by a tremendous quake echoing through the void, accompanied by the Divine King's roar resounding beneath the sky of the Underworld. Ah, Hades? A single impact turned most of the fields of truth into a basin. The previously continuous buildings had turned into nothingness, but Zeus, the cause of it all, was no better off. Although gods can regenerate flesh and blood, it still requires a bit of time. At least Zeus, caught by surprise, didn't have the chance to reshape the missing half of his body. So at this moment, a large amount of specially casted divine metal was interspersed in his flesh. These materials, with strength nearly akin to divine artifacts, were not that easily worn away. Yet Zeus couldn't understand why Hades would spend so much just to build a palace. What was his purpose? It couldn't possibly be that Hades had hidden prophecy abilities, knew he would be injured here today, and had deliberately constructed such a structure for that purpose. That joke wasn't funny at all. Chapter 647, Chapter 219 lies _2. Boom! In the center of the vast basin, accompanied by another tremor, Zeus rose from the ruins. The muscles in his flesh-blurred body writhed, constantly pushing out fragments of broken metal. That damned building had completely vanished, and now the Divine King looked up to the sky. He stared at the great serpent that had stopped attacking since his fall, filled with unwillingness and anger. The opponent had not continued the attack because once Zeus returned from the abyss to the present world, he was not so easy to deal with. A single advantage had been enough. Continuing the fight would only give him a chance to turn the tables. Even Zeus himself could confirm that if the great serpent dared to continue attacking him, the order of the present world would react by starting to strengthen itself, limiting this enemy from beyond. But just as he had seen, the opponent had timely ceased their attack, pulling back after a nearly absolute advantage strike, while Zeus, as the Divine King, had just forcibly used his sovereign power in Tartarus. He could not defy order again so soon by fighting in the mortal realm. This was clearly his own plan, to retreat immediately after overcoming a move in the abyss, but now, perhaps the life in the abyss had seen him drive back the Lord of Hell with his valiant appearance, but his downfall had also been witnessed by the beings of the underworld. Moreover, not just the underworld. At least wrapping the underworld were those primordial gods, all definitely taking all this in. This serpent, and Hades. One unexpected event happened after another, as well as this damned feudal system. If he had direct control over the underworld, Then the moment he left the abyss, he would have been able to instantly mobilize the power of the entire underworld to support himself, and he wouldn't have been so disgracefully knocked underground by his opponent. But what was done could not be changed. His breath rose from his body, spreading in an almost provocative manner. Yet the great serpent in the sky showed no reaction, as if watching a clown perform, its long body twisting and winding. Huff! Zeus slowly exhaled. His opponent probably wouldn't continue fighting him according to his desires, while at the portal of the abyss, that previous opponent's aura faintly revealed itself. Although he didn't know why he hadn't stood out together, at this moment, Zeus could only swallow this loss. Who are you, and why did you ambush me? A flash of divine light in his eyes. Zeus called out loudly. He expected his opponent to respond, be it all is fair in war, or even directly mocking him for not realizing in time, he could accept it all. However, up in the sky, the humanized head of the great serpent seemed to show a smile, a hint of malice flitting across its figure. Ambush, divine king of the present world, what nonsense are you talking? Have you forgotten? Just a moment ago, you were almost beaten to death right in front of me. Oh, I almost forgot. The gods of the present world care a lot about face, right? Shut up. A placid voice echoed in the sky, and Zeus almost saw black before his eyes. Distorting the truth. This sort of thing was supposed to be something he did, since when had these monsters, who are not supposed to be gods, also learned to blatantly lie? However, looking around, Zeus awkwardly realized, it seems, possibly, maybe, no one could prove what had happened in the abyss. Pontus Euxinus, deep beneath the ocean trench. The positioning remained unchanged from previously, and unlike what many expected, when Erebus sensed the upheaval in the abyss, he did not hurry to intervene. Instead, he merely observed from the perspective of his domain, and incidentally, he also opened a live feed for Pontus beside him. After all, unlike on the surface, occurrences on the ground are more likely to reach the underworld, as every corner of the earth can access the portals to the underworld, but not vice versa, which is due to its unique spatio-temporal structure. Aside from acting as an audience faced with such a tangible example, Erebus decisively took on the role of commentator. However, his commentary clearly lacked justice. Look, Pontus, as I have mentioned before, once Uranus awakens, Zeus is unlikely to be able to protect your safety, so pledging allegiance to him is meaningless. You are a god who has lived through 3 epochs, having witnessed the clash of great divine powers more than once. You should be aware, being from the same domain. The gap between us is immense, just like the vast difference between you and those minor gods with feeble divine powers. Smiling, as he listened to the dialogue of the great serpent from the image before him, Erebus acknowledged internally that the other was completely making things up, but in that moment, he still provided corroboration in his capacity as a primordial god. Who is Zeus? What are his battle achievements? At the end of the second epoch, standing in front of Cronus, he dared not even breathe. Later, he became great by leveraging the position of the divine king, but still fell far short of his grandfather and father. Uranus, despite being severely weakened, still managed to suppress Gaia and subdue the 12 titans. Cronus, in his full glory, could suppress Gaia with one hand, while Zeus could only win by exploiting the enemy's own mistakes, and even then, it took him 3 days and 3 nights. And what about Typhon? Although Pontus felt that Erebus made some valid points, he still asked. After all, he was not very familiar with the power disparity among the great divine powers. Apart from their battle records, there was no other standard to measure by. Typhon, how could you? The last battle took place offshore. Pontus, don't tell me you don't know what happened. With a faint smile, Erebus was merciless. If scheming also counts as strength, do you think Zeus had a chance to feed Uranus another fruit of one day? He is a tyrant, not a madman. Pontus, the current situation is clear evidence. Any great divine power could appear out of nowhere and immediately reduce Zeus to this state. Faced with such a scenario, the divine king, instead of acknowledging the disparity, first attempted to use his traditional skill to twist right and wrong, attempting to smear Typhon with claims of carelessness and ambush. So, here comes the question, Pontus, do you believe what he said? No, you are right. He indeed cannot protect the lineage of the sea god before Uranus. After a moment of silence, considering that the other party had a history of deceit, Pontus decided to trust the great serpent and the Lord of Darkness. After all, monsters, as everyone knows, why would these madmen lie? Therefore, what they said must surely be not lies. Chapter 648, Chapter 220 Glory. Deep in the trench, Pontus ultimately acknowledged this assertion. However, what truly convinced the primordial sea god wasn't because of Zeus's previous actions altering history and inverting the truth, nor the ludicrous reason of believing that the great serpent from the abyss was inherently trustworthy. This matter was only good for a laugh. For real judgment, one obviously needed more practical reasons. And for Pontus, the most practical reason was undoubtedly Zeus's character and his own longing for power. The latter goes without saying. Throughout the second epic, the sea gods fought amongst themselves only to unify the sea and to break the upper limits of a true god's power. His so-called withdrawal from the world was actually because he was frightened by the sun bathed in the sea, realizing the slim chance of defeating the god of the ocean, rather than truly seeing through the vanity of life. As for the former, that's just Zeus's consistent problem with style. Although today's chaos had yet to possess the word politics, analogous terms still existed. At least in Pontus's view, Zeus undoubtedly leaned more towards political thinking rather than divine thinking, making him a rare oddity among the innate deities. Just as he previously assessed Zeus, if the lineage of the primordial sea god were willing to submit to the divine court, the divine king would definitely absolve them of past grievances. But conversely, if he chose to abandon Zeus and completely separate himself from the divine court, what reaction would Zeus then offer? A wise choice, Pontus. Zeus is such a person. Even if you establish your own domain, when that day comes, he will definitely make the most appropriate decision after weighing his options. With a slight nod, seeing that Pontus had finally relented, Erebus felt increasingly at ease. Despite holding the card of Uranus, if Pontus had made up his mind to give up everything and permanently slumber, unwilling to cooperate with him, Erebus really would have no solution. After all, he wasn't the sea god. In the world of the innate gods, violence wasn't the solution to every problem. Fortunately, the other party had come to an understanding at this crucial juncture, making the remaining tasks much easier. Now, let's talk about what comes next. Zeus shouldn't linger in the underworld for too long. Once he returns, it will be time for me to leave. Back to the point, if you want to gain greater strength, you are likely fated to set aside past grievances with your old friend and join together. All right, nodding in agreement, Pontus had no objections. Unifying the sea is the most direct way for a sea god to enhance their strength. It's just that before, he and the god of the ocean both aimed to lead the unification themselves. However, now they may both have to step back, because in the face of the impending threat, if they don't want to place all their hopes on Zeus, they will necessarily have to start anew. Even though Zeus is someone who would compromise for his goals, the premise is that one must possess the capital that is worthy of his compromise. To him, those who can only be of benefit but pose no threat are like wheat in the field, harvested one year with the promise of the next. Just like the goddess of agriculture, Zeus never considers her desires. Those who can pose a threat but bring no benefits, on the other hand, are like the demon king Typhon, disruptive forces challenging the calm and stability of the present world. Zeus would only attempt to eliminate you together with all the deities of the divine court. And if he can't defeat you, he will drive you away. No other options are available. Only the third type of god truly makes him exert considerable effort to win over those who can both offer benefits and impose a significant threat to Zeus. The awakening of the Heavenly Father automatically grants Zeus and me a mutual interest, so as long as I pose a sufficient threat, the crisis from Zeus will resolve itself. Substituting Poseidon might in a fury harm both himself and a traitor, but Zeus is not that kind of person. You have convinced me, Prince Erebus? However, before that, I still hope you understand. Looking at the Lord of Darkness holding the warm orb in his hand, Pontus spoke gravely. I am unaware of others, but at least for me, I will not accept an outcome where Oceanus gains the most benefit. Otherwise, what would have been the point of the struggles over the past epic? Hey, of course, I understand. Speaking indifferently, the Lord of Darkness was unconcerned by Pontus's words. Let them make a fuss if they wish. He'd prefer it if they continue to be at odds after the war foreseen to conclude the third epic is over. The underworld. Above the former site of the Fields of Truth, having exited combat status, Zeus's divine body finally restored to completeness. But compared to physical wounds healing, the scars on his spirit were far from repaired. The immense shadow in the sky had been out of sight for an unknown time, but the traces it left remained enduringly. The edge of the underworld seemed to have an additional wall reaching immeasurable heights, the powerful residue of life deterring anything external from drawing near. However, this wasn't the reason for Zeus's foul mood. Actually, the one he forced a smile at was not someone else, but his own brother. Hades, you've come. I didn't quite see you earlier. As the king of the underworld, is your palace usually empty? Barely managing a smile, yet Zeus couldn't help but throw a veiled barb. However, Hades, who had hurried back to the temple site, merely looked expressionless, cold, and indifferent, much like the preconceived notions other gods had of him. Zeus, the temple of the underworld king is naturally populated, but once the gatekeeper of the underworld reported your movements to me, it became deserted. After all, you came to track the enemy, and my confidence in you isn't exactly high. Speaking plainly, Hades's words were both straightforward and devoid of affection. Cough, Hades, my brother, you don't also believe the monster's nonsense, do you? You see, it doesn't dare to lay a hand on me anymore, So, divine king, it doesn't matter which of you is telling the truth, regarding the destruction of my palace, what do you intend to do about it? At a loss for words, Zeus naturally wanted to say something like, then I'll build you another one, but as he was about to speak, he realized he might not have the capacity to do so. Well, that's the situation, considering Hades had gone mad, actually building such a colossal palace out of divine material. Even for him, who held the corresponding divine authority, it was probably a matter of spending hundreds of years gathering materials, as for Zeus. Therefore, it's not about the rarity of the material but rather that the divine court simply did not have such reserves. After all, under normal circumstances, which deity would need so many materials? Without a demand, there would be no storage. And thinking about this, Zeus's face couldn't help but darken. Waves of phantom pain came, and he still couldn't understand why Hades had done this. Regarding the matter of your palace, my brother, could you first address a confusion of mine? Taking a deep breath, Zeus asked as calmly as he could, why did you build such a palace? It's entirely unnecessary. No, it was necessary. It collapsed 3 times before, and 2 of those were related to you, and now it's the 4th time. So the facts prove that not only was it necessary for me to do so, but I also didn't do it enough. After all, no one could have anticipated that this time it would be you who personally caused its destruction. Speaking indifferently, Hades kept his gaze fixed on Zeus, then continued to ask the soul-searching question. So, divine king of Olympus, about you entering the underworld without prior notice and then destroying my property on your own, how do you plan to compensate me for my loss? My demand is not high. You just need to rebuild it exactly as it was. Once again at a loss for words, Zeus instantly understood what the first 2 times of destruction meant. At that moment, he felt he should not have chased into the underworld. Luckily, although the situation was a bit stiff for a moment, he soon thought of a way to temporarily solve the problem. Cough, Hades, I sympathize with your predicament, but as you have seen, none of the disasters were instigated by me. It has always been others challenging my authority. How about this? The banquet on the surface is still underway. Before my departure, all gods had already been on edge against each other. I need to go back to stabilize the situation first. As for your palace, after pondering for a moment, Zeus made a promise. When the new palace is built, I will bless it with the sovereign authority of the divine king, granting it the strength not to be destroyed. Moreover, like the seals that once imprisoned the titans in the abyss, this blessing will exist as long as the sovereign authority of the divine king does. It will never be destroyed, and even if it suffers any damage, it will be able to restore itself to its original state. Slightly taken aback, Hades had not truly expected Zeus to build him a new one, given that most of the world's minerals were under his jurisdiction, and he couldn't be clearer about the other's capability. But the new compensation plan Zeus proposed did seem quite satisfactory to him. Indeed, he had not thought it through enough before. Just linking it with the power of the underworld might not ensure its eternal indestructibility. But with the addition of a safeguard from the divine authority of the divine king, that should be foolproof. After all, the world never lacked for crazy deities. Like Gaia, who dared to collide with the pillars of heaven, but none capable of completely destroying the divine authority of the divine king had ever come to his knowledge. Fine, but remember to send the Cyclops and Hephaestus." With a much softer tone, Hades accepted the compensation. Double insurance, multiple layers of protection. This time, his fifth-generation temple would surely be without problems. The affair of the underworld finally came to a close, and Zeus tried to align with Hades on a unified front regarding his defeat narrative. Unfortunately, Hades indicated that the underworld had few deities, infinite things, and both primordial gods and the goddess of the nether moon watching over it, so it wasn't as easy to manipulate as surface affairs. And as with the matter of Typhon, Zeus had ultimately won the day. When you win, any explanation can be palatable. But the short skirmish not long ago had clearly not ended in Zeus's favor, and any explanation would only backfire. Then let's emphasize its evilness, letting all gods know that regardless of how strong the monster is or isn't, it is undeniably evil and cannot coexist with all gods. Making a silent decision, this was the only method Zeus could think of. Crossing the Styx River Acheron, the divine king decided to return to the mortal realm. But at that moment, he suddenly looked back. In the underworld, no, deep in the abyss, an intuition told him that something closely related to him was happening there. What was it? Zeus was puzzled, his unusual response to the abyss not being the first or second occurrence. Yet he knew well the dangers that lay therein, and no matter what, he wouldn't venture there without full assurance. It seems I must think of other ways. This intuition of fate, no, I must still find out, he thought. If the gods entered, they might not return, so what being could go there, capable of avoiding death from the common creatures of that place, and also not be targeted by those two hellish beings? Humans, like Perseus once before, wielding the divine artifacts of the gods and solving problems for them. I remember, didn't I leave a child like that in the human world a few years ago? It seemed so, Zeus recalled, and that child had also accidentally established a connection with Hera. It was said that before recognizing the child's true identity, Hera had even named him, was it, Glory of Hera? Chapter 649, Chapter 221 Trial and Omen. About Zeus' divine child, there were always many legends in the mortal realm. After all, in the past 1,000 years, no one but Zeus himself knew exactly how many offspring he had left behind. Among these beings with the blood of the divine king, there were mortals, demigods, and true gods, although the vast majority of them eventually became known to the world over time. There still were two children, for various reasons, to this day have not made a name for themselves in the mortal realm, and barely a few people have heard of their existence. The first was a natural deity, a son Zeus sired hundreds of years ago, and he was also the founder and builder of Thebes, the outside grandson of Cadmos. This prince, who had earned his merits during the chaos of Typhon, had with the goddess of harmony Harmonia not just one child. Semele was amongst the most beautiful of them. Then, during one unexpected encounter, the young princess happened to meet the king of all gods, who was disguised as a mortal. Calling himself Clonides, son of Cronus, Zeus easily captured the princess's heart with his exquisite craft and quickly conceived a progeny with her. But, as the old saying goes, the women who get involved with Zeus usually don't end up very differently if they aren't deities, they either die or live in agony. And so, as always, wherever Zeus strayed, Hera was sure to follow closely behind. When Hera learned of Semele and her child, the heavenly empress naturally flew into a rage, and she immediately disguised herself as an old woman to meet with the pregnant Semele, starting her routine journey of persecuting the mistress. She first subtly led the princess to mention her husband, who was often away, and then voiced doubts when Semele boasted. She claimed that the man could never be Zeus, king of all gods, that it was all just hubris on Semele's part, or she herself had been deceived. Hearing these words, the princess was naturally angered, but she also felt some doubts and unease in her heart. After all, Zeus had never shown a divine demeanor, so was he really the divine king? The young princess immediately decided that the next time they met, she would demand Zeus to reveal his true form, to display the sacred shape that would signify his divine authority. And coincidentally, on the very day of their next meeting, Zeus promised the princess that, to make up for his long absence, he was willing to grant her a reasonable request. The rest of the story quite naturally followed. The unknowing mortal princess and her palace were reduced to ashes amidst thunder and fire, and the true god no longer had a non-divine mother. Only as an immortal deity did her son with Zeus manage to survive by chance. Well, What other stories lie behind this one, the world does not know. How that deity, who had not yet been born from his mother's womb, continued to grow, is also unclear to anyone. In any case, this natural deity, a son of the god king, to this day has no notable stories passed down about him. Even considering that no divine phenomena occurred during the Third Era, the existence of this god said to be named Dionysus is still doubted by many on Mount Olympus. However, as a son of Zeus, he still has a bit of presence. Dionysus is the first, and the second of Zeus' unknown children is this, glory of Hera. If the former is unknown because, under the influence of some power, no related news was spread in the mortal world, then the latter is purely because he is too young. He was far from being an adult, and even his name had only been given recently because of Hera's presence. But since Zeus had thought of him at this time, there certainly must be a reason for it. Glory of Hera, he should be called Heracles. Hey, having been born and immediately managing to strangle the serpent sent by Hera, such exceptional talent surely won't be inferior to that of the king of Athens. Son of the divine king, having accidentally suckled Hera's milk and killed a serpentine demonic monster shortly after birth, truly guided by fate. I initially wanted to make you king of Mycenae, a leader among my many offspring in the mortal world, but now it seems you might be able to do even more for me. This was a multifaceted matter. After all, the weird fluctuations of world power had not occurred before the child was born, and so Zeus had thought to sire such an offspring who would unite his divine descendants on earth to strengthen the link between sovereignty and humans. And even from then on make his name Zeus a symbol in human civilization. But plans cannot keep up with changes. Now he rather not have his progeny stand out to rule the mortal world. With a great war looming in the mortal realm, it would be better for all gods to involve themselves. With that being the case, this child of exceptional talent naturally has much more value. Exactly, that's right. As he crossed the gates of the underworld, and his thoughts shifted, Zeus suddenly realized he might truly need such a capable son in the mortal realm. Perhaps many of his tasks could be accomplished with his help, like improving his image in the underworld, or dealing with an ancient god who had been holding up the sky for half an era, to see if he had any intention of repentance. Chapter 650, Chapter 221 Trials and Omens _2. But let's not rush things. Whether he can grow to the level one need him to reach is still a matter of uncertainty. Moreover, before that, I need to make some more preparations. Waiting a bit longer doesn't really matter. A few years or even a decade is trivial for a deity. Once he grows up, I'll test his abilities a bit more before ultimately deciding whether to entrust him with the important task of venturing into the abyss to fulfill his mission. After all, other places are manageable, even if troubles arise. He can fix them on time. Perseus managed it with the divine artifact of all gods. But Tartarus is beyond his control. Once entered, don't expect anyone else to offer help. Zeus doesn't care so much about whether the boy lives or dies now. But if he bungles his task in the future, that would create a very difficult issue. In the mortal realm, at the Acropolis, Zeus's journey to the underworld was temporarily concluded, and in the chamber of the Acropolis, Gaia, who was repeatedly mentioned despite not being present, finally looked satisfied at the masterpiece before her. The crowd on the mountainside where the chamber was built was slightly chaotic, because the recent brief clash in the underworld had left its traces. Though it didn't fully reach the surface. A minor earthquake is not a big deal for the plains, but for a city built on a hill, it was a considerable disaster. Not bad, it seems you've succeeded. Pandora, right? How do you feel? Or more specifically, how do you sense it right now? In one corner of the platform, a woman in her 40s looked at Pandora with eager anticipation. Just moments before, as the earth quaked momentarily, Gaia distinctly felt the divine fragment of the authority of material destruction flicker. Perseus's will, belonging originally to him, momentarily awakened, briefly containing the chaos within the fragment. Meanwhile, as the earthquake emerged, all the people in the Acropolis felt panic in an instant. Many among them started praying for divine protection, hoping it was not a major natural disaster, and during these prayers, many mentioned the need to call upon the deity to drive away the disaster-causing witch. Under these circumstances, Pandora's spirit seemed to be lifted as well. The moment she touched the divine fragment, she seemed to gain the ability to connect with the power of faith to some extent. Though not comparable to a deity, Having such a power was still significant compared to not having it at all. So, her previously faltering spirit instantly stabilized, and without a doubt, she successfully contained that piece of divinity. Slowly opening her eyes, at that moment, the world seemed to change in Pandora's eyes. What was once blurry became clear, and many things she couldn't touch before were now within reach. And most importantly, after so many years, Pandora for the first time possessed power beyond the mortal world. The power of destruction flowed in her, and from many perspectives, she was now a legit demigod, not by race, but by sheer strength. You see, although she had lived a long time, Epimetheus had never allowed her to access such potent transcendent knowledge to prevent her from gaining the power to defy him in the mortal realm. Thus, until today, she had never possessed real power. But now, everything was different. Yes, I succeeded, I survived. With her palm open, Pandora felt, at that moment, as if she could tear open the sky and the earth, possessing the power to destroy everything. However, her sanity quickly overcame this swell of emotion. She could never match Gaia. She likely couldn't even defeat Epimetheus as he was now. The divine fragment she contained was not the largest one. Thus, taking a deep breath, Pandora restrained her thoughts and turned towards the direction Gaia indicated. There, countless points of light still twinkled, but clearly, Gaia was pointing to the largest one. That was the core of the god of material destruction, Perseus's authority, and whoever held it, held one of the ultimate divine authorities. Directly, Pandora had felt nothing toward it, but now, perhaps because she had fused with the divine fragment, an inexplicable connection had formed between the two. I feel I can influence it, but only a little. It can influence me, indeed quite a large part. However, after hesitating for a moment, Pandora continued. It seems to sense that, beneath the ground underfoot, a destruction had just occurred. I understand. Being able to communicate normally, without severe effects on the mind. Pandora, you are performing much better than I had expected. Ignoring the latter part of the response, Gaia naturally knew what had just happened in the underworld. Zeus was wounded, which naturally made her happy, but Pandora's current state excited her even more. It seems my guess was not wrong, fate indeed favors you. If it weren't for this sudden disaster, you might not have completed this step so easily, nor would you know how to proceed to increase your success rate in fusing higher-order divine fragments. But now it's different. The material destruction can stimulate the consciousness within the fragments, reduce the chaos. Letting life link this disaster with you personally can stimulate your spirit, anchoring your state. This looks a bit like an alternative ritual. Pandora, from this perspective, you have also pioneered the integration of divine fragments for life in the world to come. As her voice softened, Gaia gently touched the utterly ordinary-looking earthen jar. This is the power of fate. Although she didn't know if it was indeed fate, since the outcome was good, she accepted it as such. Now that I have succeeded, can I leave? Although the most crucial step was over, in Pandora's mind, she was still constantly impacted by the spiritual domain. The disintegration of all things, the fragmentation of rocks, the redirection of rivers, everything related to material destruction had been impacting her will, though not as fiercely and madly as when she had just fused. Now, she just wanted to rest for a while, away from this ancient deity. However, clearly, Gaia had no intention of letting her leave. You cannot leave yet, Pandora. My visit to you was not simply to let you fuse with a divine fragment. This is just the beginning. And there is much more you must do. I understand. Bowing her head slightly, as the information brought by the divine fragment surged in her mind, a wave of destructive desires also involuntarily rose within Pandora's heart. But she endured because she did not yet have the power to resist. However, aside from bowing her head, the witch who brought disaster and curses cast a glance at the brightest one among those million twinkling points, which was also where the core authority of material destruction resided. She had told Gaia about her feeling, about sensing the destruction beneath the earth, but in reality, she hadn't told everything. Because it seemed that this authority could sense not only past destructions but also those about to come. And that next destruction seemed to be imminent, in a corner of the mortal realm. Which direction? I remember it being a small nation under Athens' control. The memory had long blurred and Pandora put the matter out of her mind. It wasn't that she thought this destruction would affect Gaia. She simply wanted to know, How much could Gaia truly understand about her, about these divine fragments, and even about the control of the authority of destruction?